Chapter 24 of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. In the gray of the morning, Billy came to himself and stared around in the stuffy grimness everywhere. The gag was still in his mouth. He put up his hand involuntarily and pulled it out, and then remembered that his hands had been tied. Then he must have succeeded in breaking the cord. The other hand was still encumbered and his feet were tied together, but it happened that the well hand was the freed one, and so after a hard struggle he succeeded in getting out of the tangle of knots and upon his feet. He worked cautiously because he wasn't sure how much of what he remembered was dream and how much was reality. The two men might be in the house yet, very likely were, asleep somewhere. He must steal down and get away before they awoke. There was something warm and sticky on the floor, and it had got on his clothes, but he took no notice of it at first. He wondered what that sick pain in his shoulder was, but he had not time to stop and see now or even think about it. He must call the chief before the men were awake. So he managed to get upon his feet, land steady himself against the wall, for he felt dizzy and faint when he tried to walk. But he managed to get into the hall and peer into each room, and more as he went, he felt he was alone in the house. Then he had failed and the men were gone. Aw, gee, Pat too! What a fool he had been, thinking he could manage the affair. He ought to have taken the chief into his confidence and let him come along. Aw, gee! Down in the kitchen he found a pail of water and a cup. He drank thirstily. His head felt hot and the veins in his neck throbbed. There seemed to be a lump on his forehead. He bathed his face and head. How good it felt! Then he found a whiskey bottle on the table half full. This, after carefully smelling, he poured over his bruised wrists, sopping it on his head and forehead, and finally pouring some down his shoulder that pained so, and all that he did was done blindly, like one in a dream, just an involuntary searching for means to go on and fulfill his purpose. After another drink of water, he seemed to be able to think more clearly. That tapping in the cellar yesterday, what had that been? He must look and see. Yes, that was really what he had come about. Perhaps the men were down there yet hidden away. He opened the cellar door and listened. Doggone it, where was that gun of his? But the flashlight. Yes, the flashlight. He shot the light ahead of him as he went down, moving as in a dream, but keeping true to type, cautious, careful, stealthy. At last he was down. No one there. He turned the little flash into every nook and cranny, not excepting the ledges above the cellar wall whereon the floor beams rested. Once he came on a tin box, long and flat and new-looking. It seemed strange to meet it here. There was no dust upon it. He poked it down with his torch and it sprawled open at his feet. Papers, long folded papers printed with writing in between, like bonds or deeds or something. He stooped and waved the flash above them and caught the name Shafton in one. It was an insurance paper, house and furniture. He felt too stupid to quite understand, but it grew into his consciousness that these were the things he was looking for. He gathered them up, stuffing them carefully inside his blouse. They would be safe there. Then he turned to go upstairs, but stumbled over a pile of coal out in the floor and fell. It gave him a sick sensation to fall. It almost seemed that he couldn't get up again, but now he had found the papers, he must. He crawled to his knees and felt around, then turned his light on. This was strange. A heap of coal out in the middle of the floor, almost a foot from the rest. A rusty shovel lay beside it, a chisel and a big stone. Ah, the tapping! He got up, forgetting his pain, and began to kick away the coal, turning the flashlight down. Yes, there was a crack in the cement, a loose piece. He could almost lift it with his foot. He pried at it with the toe of his shoe, and then lifted it with much effort out of the way. It was quite a big piece, more than a foot in diameter. The ground was soft underneath, as if it had been recently worked over. He stooped and plunged the fingers of his good hand in and felt around, lying the light on the floor so it would shed a glare over the spot where he worked. He could feel down several inches. There seemed to be something soft, like cloth or leather. He pulled at it and finally brought it up. A leather bag girt about with a thong of leather. He picked the knot and turned the flash in. It sent forth a million green lights. There seemed also to be a rope of white glistening things that reminded him of Saxy's tears. That brought a pang. Saxy would be crying. He must remember that and do something about it. He must have been away a long time, and perhaps those men would be coming back. But it wouldn't do to leave these things here. They were the Shafton jewels. What anybody wanted of a lot of shiny little stones like that and a rope of tears? But then if they did, and they were theirs, and they ought to have 'em. This was the thing he had come to do, get those jewels and papers back. make up as far as he could for what he had done, and he must do it now quick before he got sick. He felt he was getting sick, and he mustn't think about it or he would turn into Aunt Saxon. That was the queerest thing. Back in his mind he felt this was Aunt Saxon down here in the haunted cellar, playing with green stones and ropes of tears, and he must hurry quick before she found him and told him he couldn't finish what he had to do. He did the work thoroughly, feeling down in the hole again, but found nothing more. Then he stuffed the bag inside his blouse and buttoned up his sweater with his well hand and somehow got up the stairs. That arm pained him a lot, and he found his sweater was wet. So he took his handkerchief and tied it tight around the place that hurt the most, holding one end in his teeth to make the knot firm. The sun blinded him as he stumbled down the back steps and went to get his wheel, but somehow he managed it, plunging through the brakes and tangles and back to the road. It ran in his brain where the Shaftons lived out in the country on the Jersey shore. He had a mental picture in the back of his mind how to get there. He knew that when he struck the high road there was nothing to do but keep straight on till he crossed the state line, and then he would find it somehow, although it was miles away. If he had been himself, he would have known it was an impossible journey in his present condition, but he wasn't thinking of impossibilities. He had to do it, didn't he? He, Billy, had set out to make reparation for the confusion he had wrought in his small world, and he meant to do so, though all hell should rise against him. Hell! That was it. He could see the flames in hot little spots where the morning sun struck. He could hear the bells striking the hour in the world he used to know that was not for him any more. He zigzagged along the road in a crazy way, and strange to say he met nobody he knew, for it was early. 10 minutes after he passed the crossroads, Elder Harricut went across the highway toward Economy to his day's work, and he would have loved to have seen Billy and his rusty old wheel staggering along in that crazy way and smelling of whiskey like a whole moonshiner, fairly reeking with whiskey as he jogged down the road, and a queer little tinkle now and then just inside his blouse as if he carried loaded dice. Oh, he would have loved to have caught Billy shooting crap. But he was too late, and Billy swam on, the sun growing hotter on his aching head, the light more blinding to his bloodshot eyes, the lump bigger and bluer on his grimy forehead. About 10 o'clock a car came by, slowed down, the driver watching Billy, though Billy took no note of him. Billy was looking on the ground, dreaming he was searching for the state line. He had a crazy notion it ought to be there somewhere. The man in the car stopped and called to him, "How about putting your wheel in the back seat and letting me give you a lift? You look pretty tired." Billy lifted bleared eyes and stopped pedaling, almost falling off his wheel, but recovering himself with a wrench of pain and sliding off. "All right," said Billy. "Thanks." "You look all in, son," said the man kindly. "Yup," said Billy laconically. "Yam. Been up all night. Care if I sleep?" "Help yourself," said the man, giving a lift with the wheel and putting it in behind. Billy curled down on the back seat without further ceremony. "Where are you going, son?" Billy named the country seat of the Shaftons, having no idea how far away it was. The man gave a whistle. "What? On that wheel? Well, go to sleep, son. I'm going there myself, so don't worry. I'll wake you up when you get there." So Billy slept through the first long journey he had taken since he came to live with Aunt Saxon, slept profoundly with an oblivion that almost amounted to coma. Sometimes the man, looking back, was tempted to stop and see if the boy was yet alive, but a light touch on the hot forehead showed him that life was not extinct, and they whirled on. 3 hours later, Billy was awakened by a sharp shake of his sore shoulder and a stinging pain that shot through him like fire. Fire! Fire! He was on fire! That was how he felt as he opened his eyes and glared at the stranger. "Oh, look out there! What are you doing?" he blazed. "What do you think I am, a football? Don't touch me. I'll get out. This the place? Thanks for the ride. I was all in. Say, do you know a guy by the name of Shafton?" "Shafton?" asked the man, astonished. "Are you going to Shafton's?" "Sure," said Billy. "Anything wrong about that? Where does he hang out?" The look of Billy, and more than all the smell of him, made it quite apparent to the casual observer that he had been drinking, and the man eyed him compassionately. "Poor little fool. He's beginning young. What on earth does he want at Shafton's?" "I suppose you've come down after the reward," grinned the man. "I could have saved you the trouble if you'd told me. The kidnapped son has got home. They are not in need of further information." Billy gave him a superior leer with one eye closed. "You may not know all there is to know about that," he said impudently. "Where did you say he lived?" The man shrugged his shoulders indifferently. "Suit yourself," he said. "I doubt if they'll see you. They have had nothing but a stream of vagrants for 2 days, and they're about sick of it. They live on the next estate, and the gateway is right around that corner." "I ain't no vagrant," glared Billy, and limped away with old Trusty under his left arm. No one molested him as he walked in the arched and ivied gateway, for the gatekeeper was off on a little private errand of his own at a place where prohibition had not yet penetrated. Billy felt too heavy and dizzy to mount his wheel, but he leaned on the saddle as he walked and tried to get things straight in his head. He oughtn't to have gone to sleep, that's what he oughtn't. But this job would soon be over, and then he would hike it for home. Gee, wouldn't home feel good? And Aunt Saxon would bathe his head with witch hazel and make cold things for him to drink. Ah, gee. The pedigreed dogs, of which the place boasted a number, came suddenly down upon him in a great flare of noise, but dogs were always his friends. Why should he worry? A pity he couldn't stop to make friends with them just now. Some dogs! Here, pup! Gee, what a dog to own! The dogs whined and fawned upon him. Pedigree or no pedigree, rags and whiskey and dirt notwithstanding, they knew a man when they saw one, and Billy hadn't batted an eyelid when they tried their worst tramp barks on him. They wagged their silky tails and tumbled over each other to get first place to him, and so escorted proudly, he dropped old Trusty by a clump of imported rhododendrons, and limped up the marble steps to the wide vistas of circular piazzas that stretched to seemingly infinite distances, and wondered if he should ever find the front door. An imposing butler appeared with a silver tray and stood aghast. "Shafton live here?" inquired Billy, trying to look businesslike. "Like to see him or the missus a minute," he added as the frowning vision bowed. The butler politely but firmly told him that the master and mistress had other business and no desire to see him. The young gentleman had come home, and the reward had been withdrawn. If it was about the reward he had come, he could go down to the village and find the detective. The house people didn't want to interview any more callers. "Well, say," said Billy, disgusted, "after I've come all this way, too, you go tell her I've brought her jewels. You go tell her I've got 'em here." The butler opened the door a little wider. He suggested that seeing was believing. "Not on your tintype," snapped Billy. "I show 'em to nobody, and I give 'em to nobody but the owner. Where's the young fella? He knows me. Tell him I brang his ma's string of beads and things." Billy was weary. His head was spinning round. His temper was rising. "Aw, you make me tired. Get out of my way." He lowered his head and made a football dive with his head in the region of the dignified butler's stomach, and before that dignitary had recovered his poise, Billy, with 2 collies joyously escorting him, stood blinking in wonder over the great beautiful living room, for all the world as pretty as the church at home, only stranger, with things around that he couldn't make out the use of. "Where are they at? Where are the folks?" he shouted back to the butler, who was coming after him with menace in his eye. "What is the matter, Morris? What is all this noise about?" came a lady's voice in pettish tones from up above somewhere. "Didn't I tell you that I wouldn't see another one of those dreadful people today?" Billy located her smooth old childish face at once and strode to the foot of the stairs, peering up at the lady, white with pain from his contact with the butler, but alert now to the task before him. "Say, Mis' Shafton, I got your jewels. Would you mind taking 'em right now? 'Cause I'm all in and I want to get home." His head was going around now like a merry-go-round, but he steadied himself by the banister. "Why, what do you mean?" asked the lady, descending a step or two, a vision of marcelled white hair, violet and lace negligee, and well-preserved features. "You've got them there? Let me see them." "He's been drinking, Sarah. Can't you smell it?" said a man's voice higher up. "Come away and let Morris deal with him. Really, Sarah, we'll have to go away if this keeps up." "Say, you guy up there, just shut your trap a minute, won't you? Here, Miss Shafton, are these here yours?" Billy struggled with the neck of his blouse and brought forth the leather bag, gripped the knot fiercely in his teeth, ran his fingers in the bag as he held it in his mouth, his lamed arm hanging at his side, and drew forth the magnificent pearls. "William, my pearls!" shrieked the lady. The gentleman came down incredulous and looked over her shoulder. "I believe they are, Sarah," he said. Billy leered feverishly up at him and produced a sheaf of papers, seemingly burrowing somewhere in his internal regions to bring them forth. "And here, do these belong?" The master of the house gripped them. "Sarah, the bonds! And the South American shares!" They were too busy to notice Billy, who stood swaying by the newel post, his duty done now, the dogs grouped about him. "Say, can I get me a drink?" he asked of the butler, who hovered near, uncertain what to be doing now that the tide was turned up. The lady looked up. "Morris!" He scarcely heard the lady's words, but almost immediately a tall, slim glass of frosty drink that smelled of wild grapes, tasted of oranges, and cooled him down to the soul again, was put into his hand, and he gulped it greedily. "Where did you say you found these, young man?" The gentleman eyed him sternly, and Billy's old spirit flamed up. "I didn't say," said Billy. "But you know we've got to have all the evidence before we can give the reward." "Aw, cut it out. I don't want no reward. Wouldn't take it if you give it to me. I just want to get home. Say, you got a telephone?" "Why, certainly." This was the most astonishing burglar. "Well, where is it? Let me call long distance on it. I ain't got the tin now, but I'll pay you when I get back home." "Why, the idea! Take him to the telephone, Morris. Right there. This one." But Billy had sighted one on a mahogany desk near at hand, and he toppled to the edge of the chair that stood before it. He took down the receiver in a shaky hand, calling long distance. "This long distance? Well, gimme economy 13. The Shaftons for the instant were busy looking over the papers, identifying each jewel, wondering if any were missing. They did not notice Billy till a gruff young voice rang out with a pathetic tremble in it. "That you, Chief? This is Billy. Say, can I bother you to phone Miss Severn and ask her to tell me aunt I'm all right? Yes, tell her I'll be home soon now, and I'll explain. And, Chief, I'm mighty sorry those two guys got away, but I couldn't help it. We'll get 'em yet. Hope you didn't wait long. Tell you more when I see ya. So long." The boyish voice trailed off into silence as the receiver fell with a crash to the polished desk, and Billy slipped off the chair and lay in a huddled heap on the costly rug. "Oh, mercy!" cried the lady. "Is he drunk or what?" "Come away, Sarah. Let Morris deal." "But he's sick, I believe, William. Look how white he is. I believe he's dead. William, he may have come a long way in the heat. He may have had a sunstroke. Morris, send for a doctor, quick. And call the ambulance, too. You better telephone the hospital. We can't have him here. William, look here. What's this on his sleeve? Blood? Oh, William, and we didn't give him any reward." And so, while the days hastened on, Billy lay between clean white sheets on a bed of pain in a private ward of a wonderful memorial hospital put up by the Shaftons in honor of a child that died. Tossing and moaning and dreaming of unquenchable fire, always trying to climb out of the hot crater that held him, and never getting quite to the top, always knowing there was something he must do, yet never quite finding out what it was. And back in Sabbath Valley, Aunt Saxon prayed and cried and waited and took heart of cheer from the message the chief had sent to Lynn. And quietly the day approached for the trial of Mark Carter, but his mother did not yet know. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Mrs. Gibson, the wife of the comparatively new elder of the Sabbath Valley Church, was a semi-invalid. That is, she wasn't able to do her own work and kept help. The help was a lady of ample proportions, whose husband had died and whose fortunes were depleted. She consented to help Mrs. Gibson, provided she were considered one of the family, and she presented a continual affront of offense so that the favored family must walk most circumspectly if they would not have her retire to her room with hurt feelings and leave them to shift for themselves. On the morning of the trial she settled herself at her side at the breakfast table, after a number of excursions to the kitchen for things she had forgotten, the cream, the coffee, and the brown bread, of which Mr. Gibson was very fond. She was prepared to enjoy her own breakfast. Mr. Gibson generally managed to bolt his while these excursions of memory were being carried on and escape the morning news, but Mrs. Gibson, well knowing which side her bread was buttered, and not knowing where she could get another housekeeper, usually managed to sit it out. "Well, this is a great day for Sabbath Valley," said Mrs. Frost mournfully, spreading an ample slice of bread deep with butter, and balancing it on the uplifted fingers of one hand while she stirred the remainder of the cream into her coffee with one of the best silver spoons. She was wide and bulgy, and her chair always seemed inadequate when she settled thus for nourishment. "A great day," she repeated sadly, taking an audible sip of her coffee. "A great day," repeated little Mrs. Gibson with a puzzled air, quickly recalling her abstracted thoughts. "Yes, nobody ever thought anybody in Sabbath Valley would ever be tried for murder." "Oh," said Mrs. Gibson sharply, drawing back her chair as if she were in a hurry and rolling up her napkin quickly. "Yes, poor Mark Carter. I remember his sweet little face and his long yellow curls and his baby smile as if it were yesterday," narrowing her eyes and harrowing her voice. "I wonder if his poor mother knows yet." "I should hope not," said Mrs. Gibson, rising precipitately and wandering over to the window where hung a gilded canary cage. "Mrs. Frost, did you remember to give the canary some seed and fresh water?" "Yes, I believe so," responded the fat lady, "but you can't keep her from knowing it always. What'll you do when he's hung? Don't you think it would be easier for her to get used to it little by little? Mrs. Frost, if you were a dog, would you rather have your tail cut off all at once or little by little?" said Mrs. Gibson mischievously. "I shouldn't like to have it cut off at all, I'm quite sure," said Mrs. Frost frostily. "Well, perhaps Mrs. Carter might feel that way too," said the lady, bending over a rose geranium and pinching a leaf to smell. "I don't understand you," said Mrs. Frost from her coffee cup. "Oh, you mean that perhaps Mark may not be convicted? Why, my dear lady, there isn't a chance at all, not a chance in the world for Mark, and while I'm real sorry, I can't say I'd approve. Think of how he's carried on, going with that little hussy of a Cherry. Mrs. Harricourt says she saw him have her out riding in his automobile one day." "Oh, Mrs. Harricourt," said Mrs. Gibson impatiently. "Mrs. Frost, let's find something pleasanter to talk about. It's a wonderful morning. The air's like wine. I wonder if I couldn't take a little walk. I mean to ask the doctor." "My dear woman," said Frost patronizingly, "you can't get away from the unpleasant things in this world just by not talking about them." "It seems not," said the Gibson lady patiently, and wandered out on the porch. Down the street, Marilyn lingered by her mother's chair. "Are you going to economy today, Mother?" "Yes, dear. Your father and I are both going. Did you think you wanted to go, dear?" "Oh, I should hate it!" cried Lynn, flinging out her hands with a terrible little gesture of despair. "But I wanted to go just to stand by Mark. I shall be there anyway, wherever I am. I shall see everything and feel everything in my heart, I know. But in the night it came to me that someone ought to stay with Mrs. Carter." "Yes, dear, I had hoped you would think of that. I didn't want to mention it because I wanted you to follow your own heart's leading, but I think she needs you. If you could keep her from finding out until it was over. But suppose—" "Yes, dear, it is possible. I've thought of that, and if it comes there will be a way, I'm sure. But until it does, then suppose— Yes, Mother, I'll go and make her have one happy day first anyway. If any of those old vultures come around, I'll play the piano or scream all the while they are there and keep them from telling her a thing." "I think, dear, the vultures will all be in economy today." "All except Mrs. Frost, Mother dear. She can't get away, but she can always run across the street to borrow a cup of soda." So Lynn knelt for a moment in her quiet room, then came down, kissed her mother and father with a face of brave serenity, and went down the maple-shaded street with her silk work-bag in her hand. And none too soon. As she tapped at the door of the Carter house, she saw Mrs. Frost ambling purposefully out of the Gibson gate with a teacup in her hand. "Oh, hurry upstairs and stay there a minute till I get rid of Mrs. Frost," Lynn whispered, smiling as her hostess let her in. "I've come to spend the day with you, and she'll stay till she's told you all the news, and there won't be any left for me." Mrs. Carter, greatly delighted with Lynn's company, hurried obediently up the stairs, and Lynn met the interloper, supplied her with the cup of salt she had come for this time, said Mrs. Carter was upstairs making the beds and she wouldn't bother her to come down. Beds, mind you, as if Mark was at home, of course, and Mrs. Frost went back across the street, puzzled and baffled, and resolved to come back later for an egg after that forward young daughter of the minister was gone. Lynn locked the front door and ran upstairs. She told her hostess up to the attic to show her some ancient gowns and poke bonnets that she hadn't seen since she was a little girl, in which she and Mark used to dress up and play history stories. Half the morning she kept her up there looking at garments long folded away, whose wearers had slept in the churchyard many years, trinkets of other days, quaint old pictures, photographs and daguerreotypes, and a beautiful curl of Mark's. "Marilyn, I'm going to give that to you," the mother said as she saw the shining thing lying in the girl's hand. "There's no one living to care for it after I'm gone, and you will keep it, I know, till you're sure there's no one would want it. I mean—" "I understand what you mean," said Marilyn. "I will keep it and love it, for you and for him. and if there is ever anybody else that deserves it, why, I'll give it to them." Then they both laughed to hide the tears behind the unspoken thoughts, and the mother added a little stubbed shoe and a sheer muslin cap, all delicate embroidery and hem-stitching. "They go together," she said simply, and Lynn wrapped them all carefully in a bit of tissue paper and laid them in her silk bag. As she turned away, she held it close to her heart while the mother closed the shutters. She shuddered to think of the place where Mark was sitting now, being tried for his life. Her heart flew over the road, entered the court, and stood close by his side with her hand on his shoulder, and then slipped it in his. She wondered if he knew that she was praying for him, and standing by him, taking the burden of what would have been his mother's grief if she had known, as well as the heavy burden of her own sorrow. The air of the courtroom was heavy, for the place was crowded. Almost everybody from Sabbath Valley that could come was there, for a great many people loved Mark Carter, and this seemed a time when somehow they must stand by him. People came that liked him, and some that did not like him, but more that liked him and kept hoping against hope that he would not be indicted. The hum of voices suddenly ceased as the prisoner was led in, and a breath of awe passed over the place. For until that minute no one was quite sure that Mark Carter would appear. It had been rumored again and again that he had run away. Yet here he was, walking tall and straight, his fine head held high as had been his wont. "For all the world like he walked when he was usher at Mary Ann's wedding," whispered Mrs. Hulse from Unity. The minister and his wife kept their eyes down after the first glimpse of the white face. It seemed a desecration to look at a face that had suffered as that one had, yet the expression upon it now was more as if it had been set for a certain purpose for this day, and did not mean to change whatever came. A hopeless, sad, persist look, yet strong withal, and with a hint of something fine and high behind it. He did not look around as he sat down, merely nodded to a few close to him whom he recognized. A number pressed close as he passed, and touched him, as if they would impress upon him their loyalty, and it was noticeable that these were mostly of a humble class, working men, boys, and a few old women, people to whom he had been kind. Mrs. Severn wrote a little note and sent it up to him with the message, "Lynn is with your mother." Just that, no name signed. But his eyes sought hers at once and seemed to light, and soon, without any apparent movement on his part, a card came back to her bearing the words, "I thank you." But he did not look that way again all day, it seemed. His bearing was quiet, sad, aloof, one might almost have said disinterested. Mark's lawyer was one whom he had picked out of the gutter and literally forced to stop drinking and get back on his job. He was a man of fine mind and deep gratitude, and was having a frantic time with his client, for Mark simply wouldn't talk. "I wasn't there. I was on Stark Mountain. I am not guilty," he persisted, "and that is all I have to say." "But, my dear friend, don't you realize that mere statements unadorned and uncorroborated won't get you anywhere in court?" "All right, don't try to defend me then. Let the thing go as it will. That is all I have to say." And from this decision no one had been able to shake him. His lawyer was nearly crazy. He had raked the county for witnesses. He had dug into the annals of that night in every possible direction. He had unearthed things that it seemed no living being would have thought of, and yet he had not found the one thing of which he was in search, positive evidence that Mark Carter had been elsewhere and otherwise employed at the time of the shooting. "Don't bother so much about it, Tony," said Mark once when they were talking it over, or the lawyer was talking it over and Mark was listening. "It doesn't matter. Nothing matters any more," and his voice was weary as if all hope had vanished from him. Anthony Drew looked at him in despair. "Sometimes I almost think you want to die," he said. "Do you think I shall let you go when you pulled me back from worse than death? No, Mark, old man, we're going to pull you through somehow, though I don't know how. If I were a praying man, I'd say that this was the time to pray. Mark, what's become of that kid you used to think so much of, that was always tagging after you? Billy, what was his name?" A wan smile flitted across Mark's face, and a stiff little drawing of the old twinkle about his eyes and lips. "I think he'll turn up sometime." The lawyer eyed him keenly. "Mark, I believe you've got something up your sleeve. I believe that kid knows something, and you won't let him tell. Where is he?" "I don't know, Tony." And Mark looked at him straight with clear eyes, and the lawyer knew he was telling the truth. Just at the last day, Anthony Drew found out about the session meeting. But from Mark he got no further statement than the first one. Mark would not talk. An ordinary lawyer, one that had not been saved himself, would have given up the defense as hopeless. Anthony simply wouldn't let Mark go undefended. If there were no evidence, he would make some somehow, and so he worked, hoping against hope, up to the very last minute. He stood now, tall, anxious, a fine face, though showing the marks of wreck behind him, dark hair silvered at the edges, fine deep lines about his eyes and brows, looking over the assembled throng with nervous hurrying eyes. At last he seemed to find what he wanted and came quickly down to where the minister sat in an obscure corner, whispering a few words with him. They went out together for a few minutes, and when they came back the minister was grave and thoughtful. He himself had scoured the country road about quietly for Billy, and he was deeply puzzled. He had promised to tell what he knew. The business of the day went forward in the usual way, with all the red tape, the cool formalities, as if some trifling matter were at stake, and those who loved Mark sat with aching hearts and waited. The sovereigns in their corners sat for the most part with bended heads and praying hearts. The witnesses for the prosecution were most of them companions of the dead man, those who had drank and caroused with him, frequenters of the Blue Duck, and they were herded together, an evil-looking crowd, but with erect heads and defiant attitude, the air of having donned unaccustomed garments of righteousness for the occasion, and making a great deal of it because for once everyone must see that they were in the right. They were fairly loud-mouthed in their boasting about it. There was a little old wizened-up fellow that had been sitting with the drinks outside the booth the night Billy telephoned. There were the serving men who had waited on Mark and Cherry. There was the proprietor of the Blue Duck himself, who testified that Mark had often been there with Cherry, though always early in the evening. Once he had caught him outside the window looking in at the dancers as late as 2 o'clock at night, the same window from which the shot was fired that brought Dolph to his death. They testified that Mark had been seen with Cherry much of late driving in his car, and that she had often been in deep converse as if having a hot argument about something. The feeling was tense in the courtroom. Tears were in many eyes, hopeless tears in the eyes of those who had loved the boy for years. But the grilling order marched on, and witness after witness came, adding another and another little touch to the gradually rising structure that would shut Mark Carter away from the world that loved him and that he loved forever. Cherry was called, a flaunting bit of a child with bobbed golden hair and the air of a bold young seraph, her white face bravely painted, her cherry lips cherrier even than the cherry for which she had been named. She wore a silk coat reaching to the bottom of her frock, which was shorter than the shortest, and daring little high-heeled, many-strapped shoes with a myriad of bright buckles. Her hat was an insolent affair of cherry red. She made a blinding bit of color in the dreary courtroom. She appeared half frightened, half defiant. Her sharp little face seemed to have lost its round curves and childlike sweetness. She testified that she had been with Mark on the night of the shooting, but that he had taken her home early, and she had seen no more of him that night. She admitted that she had returned later to the Blue Duck Tavern with Dolph, and had danced late and eaten supper with him afterwards, and that it was while they were eating that the shot was fired and Dolph fell over on the table. No, she didn't see any face at the window. She had covered her face with her hands and screamed. She guessed she fainted. Questioned further, she admitted that she had had an argument with Mark earlier in the evening, but she didn't remember what it was about. They often argued. Yes, Dolph was jealous of Mark and tried to stop her going with him. Yes, Mark had tried to stop her going with Dolph too, but he never acted jealous. On and on through the sorry little details of Cherry's career. The courtroom vultures receiving it avidly, the more refined part of the company with distaste and disgust. Mark sat with stern white face looking straight at Cherry all the time she was on the stand, as if he dared her to say other than the truth. When she happened to look that way, she gave a giggling little shudder and half turned her shoulder away, avoiding his eyes. But when she was done, she had said nothing against Mark, and nothing to clear him either. The sharp, unscrupulous lawyer who acted for the prosecution had secured some fellows of the baser sort, who testified that they had seen Mark Carter buying a gun, that they had seen him creep softly to the window, peer into the room, and take aim. They had been on their way home and had seen Mark steal along in a very suspicious manner and had followed him to find out what it meant. There were 3 of them, fellows whom Mark had refused to play against on a county team because they were what is called dirty players. There had been hot words between Mark and them once when one of them had kicked a man in the face with spiked shoes who was just about to make a goal. Mark had succeeded in winning the umpire to his point of view, and the others had lost their game and incidentally some money, and they had a grudge against him. Moreover, there was money in this testimony, for the Blue Duck Tavern could not afford to have its habitués in the public eye, and preferred to place the blame on a man who belonged more to the conservative crowd. The Blue Duck had never quite approved of Mark, because though he came and went, he never drank, and he sometimes prevented others from doing so. This was unprofitable to them. So matters stood when the noon hour came, and court adjourned for lunch. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. And while the long morning dragged itself away in economy listening to a tale of shame, over on the bright Jersey coast the waves washed lazily on a silver strand reflecting the blueness of the September sky, and soft breezes hovered around the classic little hospital building that stood in a grove of imported palms and lifted its white columns picturesquely like some old Greek temple. There was nothing in the life he was living now to remind Billy of either hell or Sabbath Valley, yet for long days and weeks he had struggled through flames in a deep, dark pit lighted only by lurid glare, and his soul had well nigh gone out under the torture. Once the doctors and nurses had stood around and waited for his last breath. This was a marked case. The Shaftons were deeply interested in it. The boy had mysteriously brought back all their valuable papers and jewels that had been stolen from them, and they were anxious to put him on his feet again. It went sadly against the comfortable self-complacent grain of a Shafton to feel himself under such mortal obligation to anyone. But Billy was tougher than anyone knew, and one night after he had made the usual climb through the hot coals on his bare knees to the top of the pit, and come to the place where he always fell back, he held on a little tighter and set his teeth a little harder, and suddenly, with a long hard pull that took every atom of strength in his wasted young body, he went over the top. Over the top and out into the clean, open country where he could feel the sea breeze on his hot forehead and know that it was good. He was out of hell, and he was cooling off. The first step in the awful fight that began that night in the old haunted house on the mountain had been won. For 3 days he lay thus, cooling off and resting. He was fed and cared for, but he took no cognizance of it except to smile weakly. Swallowing things was like breathing. You had to do it, and you didn't think about it. The 4th day he began to know the nurses apart, and to realize he was feeling better. As yet the past lay like a blur of pain on his mind, and he hadn't a care about anything save just to lie and know that it was good to smell the salt and see the shimmer of blue from the window. At times when he slept, the sound of bells and old hymns came to him like a dream, and he smiled. But on the 5th morning he lifted his light head uncertainly and looked out of the window. Gee, that was pretty! And he dropped back and slept again. When he awoke there was a real meal for him. No more slops. Soup and potato and a bit of bread and butter. Gee, it tasted good. He slept again, and it was morning, or was it the same morning? He didn't know. He tried to figure back and decided he had been in that hospital about 3 days, but when the next morning dawned and he felt the life creeping back into his veins, he began to be uncertain. He asked the nurse how soon he could get up and get dressed. She smiled in a superior way and said the doctor hadn't said. It would likely be some time yet. He had been pretty sick. He told her sharply he couldn't spare much more time, and asked her where his clothes were. She laughed and said, "Oh, put away. You'll have some new clothes when you get well. I heard Mrs. Shafton talking about it this morning when she was in the office. She's coming to see you pretty soon, and they mean to do a lot for you. You brought back her jewels, didn't you? Well, I guess you'll get your reward all right." Billy looked at her blankly. Reward? Gosh, was that reward going to meet him again? "Say," he said, frowning, "I want my own clothes. I don't want any new ones. I want my own. Say, I've got some stuff in my pockets I don't want to have monkeyed with." "All right," she said cheerily. "They're put away safe. You can have them when you're well." But when he asked her suddenly what day it was, she said vaguely, "Tuesday," and went away. He was so tired then he went to sleep again and slept till they brought his dinner, a big one, chicken and fixings and jelly and a dish of ice cream. Oh, gee! And then he went to sleep again. But in the morning, how many days was it then? He woke to sudden consciousness of what he had to do and to sudden suspicion of the time. Billy was coming back to his own. His wiliness had returned. He smiled at the nurse ravishingly and asked for a newspaper, but when she brought it he pretended to be asleep, so she laid it down and went away softly. But he nabbed that paper with a weak hand as soon as her back was turned and read the date. His heart fell down with a dull thud. The 3rd! This was the day of the trial. It couldn't be. He read it again. Was it really the day of the trial? The paper that had the court program had been in his trousers pocket. He must have it at once. Perhaps he had made a mistake. Oh, gee, what it was to be helpless. Why, he was weaker than Aunt Saxon. He called the nurse crossly. She bustled in and told him the doctor had just said he might set up tomorrow if he kept on without a temperature for 24 hours longer. But he paid no heed to her. He demanded his clothes with a young roar of a voice that made her open her eyes. Billy had heretofore been the meekest of meek patients. She was getting the voice and manner now that he generally retained for family use. He told her there was something in the pocket he must see right away, and he made such a fuss about it that she was afraid he would bring up his temperature again, and finally agreed to get the clothes if he would lie real still and rest afterward. Billy dropped his head back on the pillow and solemnly said, "All right." He had visions of going to court in blue and white striped pajamas. It could be done, but he didn't relish it. Still, if he had to... The nurse brought his jacket and trousers. The sweater was awfully dirty, she said, but she was finally prevailed upon to bring that too, and Billy obediently lay down with closed eyes and his arms stretched out comfortingly over the bundles. The nurse hovered round till he seemed to be asleep, and then slept out for a moment, and the instant her white skirt had vanished from the doorway, Billy was alert. He fumbled the bundles open with nervous fingers and searched eagerly for the bit of paper. Yes, there it was, and the date the 3rd of September. Ah, gee! He flung back the neatly tucked sheets, poked a slim white foot that didn't look like his at all into a trouser leg, paused for breath, and dove the other in, struggled into his jacket, and lay down again quickly under the sheet. Was that the nurse? He had to admit that he felt queer, but it would soon pass off, and anyhow, if it killed him, he had to go. Ah, bah! What was a little sickness, anyhow? If he stayed in the hospital any longer, they'd make a baby out of him. The nurse had not returned. He could hear the soft plunk, plunk of her rubber heels on the marble steps. She was going downstairs. Now was his time. Of course he had no shoes and stockings, but what was a little thing like that? He grasped the bundle of sweater tightly and slid out of bed. His feet felt quite inadequate. In fact, he began to doubt their identity. They didn't seem to be there at all when he stood on them, but he was not to be foiled by feet. If they meant to stick by him, they'd gotta obey him. Slowly, cautiously, with his head swimming lightly on ahead of him and a queer gasp of emptiness in the region of his chest that seemed to need a great deal of breath, he managed a passage to the door, looked down the long white corridor with its open doors and cheerful voices, saw a pair of stairs to the right quite nearby, and with his steadying hands on the cool white wall, slid along the short space to the top step. It seemed an undertaking to get down that first step, but when that was accomplished, he was out of sight, and he sat down and slid slowly the rest of the way, wondering why he felt so rotten. At the foot of the long stairs there was a door, and strange it was made so heavy. He wondered a nurse could swing it open, just a mere girl. But he managed it at last, almost winded, and stumbled out on the portico that gave to the sea, a wide blue stretch before him. He stopped, startled, as if he had unexpectedly sighted the heavenly strand, and gazed blinking at the stretch of blue with the wide white shore and the boom of an organ following the lapping of each white-crested wave. Those palm trees certainly made it look queer, like Saxe's Pilgrim's Progress picture book. Then the panic for home and his business came upon him, and he slid weakly down the shallow white steps and crunched his white feet on the gravel, wincing. He had just taken to the grass at the edge and was managing better than he had hoped when a neat little coupe rounded the curve of the drive, and his favorite doctor came swinging up to the steps, eyeing him keenly. Billy started to run and fell in a crumpled heap, white and scared and crying real tears, weak, pink tears. "Why, Billy, what are you doing here?" The stern, loving voice of his favorite doctor hung over him like a knife that was going to cut him off forever from life and light and forgiveness and all that he counted dear. But Billy stopped crying. "Nothin'," he said. "I just come out for a walk." The doctor smiled. "But I didn't tell you you might, Billy boy." "Had to," said Billy. "Well, you'll find you'll have to go back again, Billy. Come." And the doctor stooped his broad, strong shoulders to pick up the boy. But Billy beat him off weakly. "Say now, Doc, wait a minute," he pleaded. "It's just this way. I simply gotta get back home today. I'm a very important witness in a murder case, see? My best friend in the world is being tried for life, and he ain't guilty, and I'm the only one that knows it for sure and can prove it, and I gotta be there. Why, Doc, the trial's going on now, and I ain't there. It'd drive me crazy to go back and lay in that soft bed like a regular sissy and know he's going to be condemned. I put it to you, Doc, as man to man, would you stand for a thing like that?" "But, Billy, suppose it should be the end of you?" "I should worry, Doc. If I can get there in time and say what I want, I ain't caring for anything more in life, I tell ye. Say, Doc, you wouldn't stop me, would ya? If you did, I'd get thar anyhow, some way." The earnestness of the eager young face, wan in its illness, the light of love in the big gray eyes, went to the doctor's heart. He gave the boy a troubled look. "Where is it you want to go, Billy?" "Economy, Doc. It ain't far, only 2 or 3 hours' ride. I can get a jitney somewheres, I guess, to take me. I'll pay up as soon as I get home. I got $30 in the bank my own self." "Economy," said the doctor. "Impossible, Billy. It would kill you." "Then I'm going anyhow. Goodbye, Doc." And he darted away from the astonished doctor and ran a rod or so before the doctor caught up with him and seized him firmly by his well shoulder. "Billy, look here," said the doctor. "If it's as bad as that, I'll take you." "Oh, would you, Doc? Would you? I'll never forget it, Doc." "There now, Billy, never mind, son. You save your strength and let me manage this thing the right way. Couldn't I telephone and have them hold up things a few days? That can be done, you know." "Nothing doing, Doc. There's them that would hurry it up all the more if they thought I was coming back. You get in, Doc, and start her up. I can drive myself if you'll lend me the machine. Perhaps you ain't got time to go off with me like this." "That's all right, Billy. You and I are going on a little excursion. But first I've got to tell the nurse or there'll be all kinds of a time. Here, you sit in the machine." The doctor picked him up and put him in and ran up the steps. Billy sat dizzily watching and wondering if he hadn't better make his escape. Perhaps the doc was just fooling him, but in a moment back he came again, with a nurse trailing behind with blankets and a bottle. "We're going to get another car, son. This one's no good for such a trip. We'll fix it so you can lie down and save your strength for when you get there. No, son, I don't mean the ambulance," as he saw the alarm in Billy's face. "Just a nice big car. That's all right. Here she comes." The big touring car came round from the back almost immediately, and the back seat was heaped with pillows and blankets, and Billy tenderly placed among them where he was glad enough to lie down and close his eyes. It had been rather strenuous. The nurse went back for his shoes, bringing a bottle of milk and his medicine. The doctor got in the front seat and started. "Now, son," he said, "you rest. You'll need every bit of strength when you get there if we're going to carry this thing through. You just leave this thing to me and I'll get you there in plenty of time. Don't you worry." Billy, with a smile of heavenly bliss over his newly bleached freckles, settled back with dreamy eyes and watched the sea as they were passing swiftly by it, his lashes drooping lower and lower over his thin young cheeks. The doctor, glancing back anxiously, caught that look that mothers see in the young imps when they are asleep, and a tenderness came into his heart for the staunch, loyal little sinner. Dr. Norris was a good scout. If he had got a soft snap of a job in that Shafton hospital, it was good practice, of course, and a step to really big things where he wouldn't be dependent upon rich people's whims. But still, he was a good scout. He had not forgotten the days of the grasshopper, and Billy had made a great appeal to his heart. He looked at his watch, chose his roads, and put his machine at high speed. The sea receded, the Jersey pines whirled monotonously by, and by the hills began to crop up. Off against the horizon Stark Mountain loomed, veiled with a purple haze, and around another curve Economy appeared, startlingly out of place with its smug red brick walks and its gingerbread porches and plastered tile bungalows. Then, without warning, Billy sat up. How long had that young scamp been awake? Had he slept at all? He was like a man, grave and stern with business before him. The doctor almost felt shy about giving him his medicine. "Son, you must drink that milk," he said firmly. "Nothing doing unless you drink that." Billy drank it. "Now where?" asked the doctor as they entered the straggling, dirty little town. "The red brick building down the next block," pointed Billy, his face white with excitement, his eyes burning like 2 dark blue coals. The big car drew up at the curb, and no one there to notice, for everybody was inside. The place was jammed to the door. Cherry had come back late after lunch, her hat awry and signs of tears on her painted face. Her eyes were more obviously frightened, and she whispered a message which was taken up to Mark. Mark lifted a haggard face to hear it, asked a question, bowed his head, and continued listening to the cross-examination of a man who said he had heard him threaten to kill Dolph the week before the murder down at Hagg's Mills. When the witness was dismissed, Mark whispered a word to his lawyer. The lawyer spoke to the judge, and the judge announced that the prisoner wished to speak. Every eye was turned toward Mark as he rose and gave a sweeping glance around the room, his eyes lingering for just a shadow of an instant wistfully on the faces of the minister and his wife, then on again as if they had seen no one, and round to the judge's face. It was just at this instant that Billy burst into the room and wedged his way fiercely between elbows, using his old football methods, head down and elbows out, and stood a moment breathless, taking it all in. Then Mark spoke. "Your Honor, I wish to plead guilty to the charge." A great sigh like a sob broke over the hush in the courtroom, and many people half rose to their feet as if in protest, but Billy made a dive up the aisle, self and sickness forgotten, regardless of courts or law or anything, and stood between the judge and Mark. "It ain't so, and I can prove it," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The prosecuting attorney rose to a point of order like a bulldog snapping at his prey. The sergeant-at-arms rushed around like corn popping off in a corn popper. But Anthony Drew whispered a word to the judge, and after order was restored, Billy was called to the witness stand to tell his story. Dr. Norris, standing squeezed at the back of the room looking for his quondam patient, recognized with a thrill the new Billy standing unafraid before all these people and speaking out his story in a clear, direct way. Billy had etherealized during his illness. If Aunt Saxon had been there, she was washing for Gibson's that day and having her troubles with Mrs. Frost, she would scarcely have known him. His features had grown delicate, and there was something strong and sweet about his mouth that surely never had been there before. But the same old forceful boy speech wherewith he had subdued enemies on the athletic fields, bullied Aunt Saxon, and put one over on Pat at the station was still his own. He told the truth briefly and to the point, not omitting his own wrongdoing in every particular, and he swayed that crowd as a great orator might have been proud to sway a congregation. They laughed till they cried, and cried till they laughed again at Billy's quaint phrases, and they enjoyed the detour. Oh, how they enjoyed that detour! Even the judge had twinkles in his eyes. For the first time since the trial began, Mark was sitting up proudly, a warm look of vivid interest in his face, the cold mask gone. His eyes dwelt upon Billy with a look almost fatherly, at least brotherly. It was a startling contrast to what he had been all day. This was a different man. Suddenly from the corner of the prosecution, the low growl which had been gradually rising like a young storm broke, and the prosecuting attorney rose and lifted his voice above all others. "I protest, Your Honor, against this witness. He has mentioned no less than 5 different lies which he has told, and has narrated a number of episodes in which he deliberately broke the law. Is it or is it not a misdemeanor for anyone to meddle with our high roads in the manner that has just been described? By his own confession, this young man is disqualified for a witness. By his own confession, he is a lawbreaker and a liar." "Aw, gee," broke forth Billy furiously. "Didn't I tell you I come here to tell the truth and get it offen my chest?" Someone put a strong hand on Billy and silenced him, and someone else rose to protest against the protester, and the air grew tense with excitement once more. The prosecution declared that Billy was in league with Mark, that everybody knew he trailed him everywhere, therefore his testimony was worthless. He was probably bribed. There was nothing, absolutely nothing in the story the boy had told to prove anything. Billy was growing whiter and angrier, his eyes flashing, his fists clenched. His testimony was not going to be accepted after all. It had been vain to bear the shame himself. Nothing that he could do would blot out the trouble, because he had unfitted himself to blot it out. It had to be a witness who told the truth who would be believed. It had to be one with a good record to take away the shame. That was something like what Miss Marilyn said in Sunday school once, that only Jesus Christ could take the place of a sinner and make it right about our sinning, because he had never sinned. It had sounded like rot when she said it, but he began to understand what she meant now. Yes, that was it. Only God's Son could do that, and he, Billy Gaston, had tried to do it himself. The courtroom seemed to be very dark now. His head was whirling away and getting beyond his control. When he looked up, he seemed to see it on the other side of the room. He did not recognize the 2 men in handcuffs that the chief was bringing into the room. He did not hear what the judge was saying. He had slumped in a little heap on the witness stand with his eyes closed and his hands groping together. He thought that he was praying to God's Son to come and help Mark because he had failed. He wasn't good enough, and he had failed. The doctor had come with a bound up the aisle and was kneeling with Billy in his arms. Mark was leaning over the rail with a white, anxious face. The minister was trying to make a way through the crowd, and the sergeant at arms was pushing the crowd back and making a space about the unconscious boy. Someone opened a window. The chief and one of his men brought a cot. There was a pillow from the car, and there was that medicine again, bringing him back, just as he thought he had made God hear. Oh, why did they bother him? Suddenly down by the door a diversion occurred. Someone had entered with wild burning eyes, dressed in a curious assortment of garments. They were trying to put him out, but he persisted. The word was brought up. Someone has a very important piece of evidence which he wishes to present. Billy's gray eyes opened as the man mounted to the witness stand. He was lying on the cot at one side, and his gaze rested on the new witness, dazedly at first, and then with growing comprehension. Old Ike Fenner, the tailor, Cherry Fenner's father. Mark was looking at Billy and had not noticed. But the man began to speak in a high, shrill voice. "I came to say that I'm the man that killed Dolph Haskins. Mark Carter had nothing to do with it. I done it. I meant to kill him because he ruined the life of my little girl, my baby." There was a sudden catch in his voice like a great sob, and he clutched at the rail as if he were going to fall, but he went on, his eyes burning like coals. "I shot him with Tom Petrie's gun that I found atop the door, and I put it back where I found it. You take my fingerprints and compare 'em with the marks on the gun and the windowsill. You ask Sandy Robinson, he seen me do it. You ask Cherry, she seen me too. She was facing the winder eating her supper with that devil, and I shot him and she seen me. I did it." His voice trailed off. He swayed and got down from the stand, groping his way as if he could not see. The crowd gave way with a curious shudder, looking into his wild burning eyes as he passed. A girl's scream back by the door rang through the court. The man moaned, put out his hands, and fell forward. Kindly hands reached to catch him. The doctor left Billy and came to help. They carried him outside and laid him on the grass in front of the courthouse. The doctor used every restorative he had with him. Men hurried to the drugstore. They tried everything, but all to no avail. Ike Fenner, the tailor, was dead. He had gone to stand before a higher court. When it was all over, the fingerprints and the red tape, and the case had been dismissed, Mark came to Billy where he was lying in the big car waiting, with his eyes closed to keep back weak tears that would slip out now and then. He knelt beside the boy and touched his hand, the hand that looked so thin and weak and so little like Billy's. "Kid," he said gently, "Kid, you've been a wonder. It was really you that saved me, buddy. My buddy." Billy's tears welled over at the tone, the words, the proud, intimate name, but he shook his head slowly, sadly. "No," he said. "No, it wasn't me. I tried, but I wasn't fit. It had to be him. I didn't understand. They wouldn't believe me, but he came as soon as I asked." Mark looked at the doctor. "Is he wandering a little?" he asked in a low tone. "I shouldn't wonder. He's been through enough to make anyone wander. Here, son, take this." Billy smiled and obediently accepted his medicine. Mark held his hand all the way home. He knew that Mark didn't understand, but he was too tired to tell him now. Sometime he would explain, or perhaps Miss Lynn would explain it for him. He was going home to Saxey and Sabbath Valley and the bells, and Mark was free. He hadn't saved him, but Mark was free. It was like a royal passage through the village as they came into Sabbath Valley, for everybody came out to wave at Mark and Billy. Even Mrs. Harricut watched grimly from behind her Holland shades. But Billy was too weak to notice much, except to sense it distantly, and Mark would only lift his hat and bow, gravely, quietly, as if it didn't matter, just as he used to do when they carried him round on their shoulders after a football game, and he tried to get down and hide. Why did Mark still have that sad look in his eyes? Billy was too tired to think it out. He was glad when they reached Aunt Saxon's door, and Mark picked him up as he used to do when he was just a little kid, and carried him up to his room. Carried him up and undressed him, while Saxey heard the story from the doctor's lips, and laughed and cried and laughed again. The nervy little kid! He would always be a little kid to Saxey, no matter what he did. He turned over in his own bed. his bed, and smelt the sweet breath of the honeysuckle coming in at the window, heard the thrushes singing their evening song up the street. The sea had been great, but oh, you Sabbath Valley! Out there was the water-spout, and some day he would be strong enough to shin down it and up it again. He would play football this fall and run Mark's car. Mark, grave, gentle, quiet, sitting beside him till he got asleep, and his mother not knowing, down the street, and Miss Lynn. "Mark, you'll tell Miss Marilyn about it all?" He opened his eyes to murmur lazily, and Mark promised still gravely. He shut his eyes and drifted away. What was that the chief had told him down at Economy in the car? Something about 3 strange detectives stepping off the train one day and nabbing Pat? And Pat was up at Sing Sing finishing his term after AWOL. Was that straight or only a dream? And anyhow, he didn't care. He was home again. Home. And forgiven. Night settled sweetly down upon Sabbath Valley, hiding the brilliant autumn tinting of the street. Lynn had made a maple nut cake and set the table for 2 before she left for the Carters, for her mother had slipped out of the courtroom and telephoned her, and a fire was blazing in the little parlor with the lace curtains and asters in every vase all gala for the returning sun. The mother and son sat long before the fire, talking, pleasant converse, about the time when Mark would send for her to come and live with him, but not a word was said about the day. He saw that his friends had helped to save his mother this one great sorrow that she could not have borne, and he was grateful. Marilyn, up at the parsonage with a great thankfulness upon her, went about with smiling face. The burden seemed to have lifted, and she was glad. But that night at midnight there came the doctor from Economy driving hard and stopping at the parsonage. Cherry Fenner was dying and wanted to see Miss Marilyn. Would she come? End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Cherry's little bedroom under the roof was bright with the confusion of cheap finery scattered everywhere and swept aside at the sudden entrance of the death angel. A neighbor had done her best to push away the crude implements of complexion that were littering the cheap oak bureau top, and the doctor's case and bottles and glasses crowded out the giddy little accessories of beauty that Cherry had collected. 2 chairs piled high with draggled finery, soiled work aprons, and dresses made a forlorn and miscellaneous disorder in one corner, and the closet door sagged open with visions of more clothing hung many deep upon the few hooks. Mrs. Fenner stood at the head of the bed, wringing her hands and moaning uncontrolledly, and Cherry, little Cherry, lay whitely against the pillow, the color all gone from her ghastly pretty little face that had lately hid its ravished health and beauty behind a camouflage of paint. There were deep dark circles under the limpid eyes that now were full of mortal pain, and pitiful lines around the cherry mouth that had been wont to laugh so saucily. The doctor stood by the window with the attitude of grave waiting. The helpful neighbor lingered in the doorway, holding her elbows and taking a minute note of Marilyn's dress. This might be a sad time, but one had to live afterward, and it wasn't every day you got to see a simple little frock with an air like the one the minister's daughter wore. She studied it from neck to hem and couldn't see what in the world there was about it anyway to make her look so dressed up. Not a scratch of trimming, not even a collar, and yet she could look like that. Mercy! Was that what education and going to college did for folks? The light of a single unshaded electric bulb shone startlingly down to the bed, making plain the shadow of death even to an inexperienced eye. Marilyn knelt beside the bed and took Cherry's cold little hand in her own warm one. The waxen eyelids fluttered open, and a dart of something between fright and pain went over her weird little face. "Can I do anything for you, Cherry?" Marilyn's voice was tender, pitiful. "It's too late," whispered the girl in a fierce little whisper. "Send him out. I want to tell you The voice trailed away weakly. The doctor stepped over and gave her a spoonful of something, motioned her mother and the neighbor away, tiptoeing out himself and closing the door. The mother was sobbing wildly. The doctor's voice could be heard, quieting her coldly. The girl in the bed frowned and gathered effort to speak. "Mark Carter didn't mean no harm. Goin' with me?" She broke out, her breath coming in gasps. "He was trying to stop me. goin' with Dolph." The eyes closed wearily. The lips were white as chalk. She seemed to have stopped breathing. "It's all right, Cherry." Marilyn breathed softly. "It's all right. I understand. Don't think any more about it." The eyes opened fiercely again. A faint determination shadowed round the little mouth. "You gotta know," she broke forth again with effort. "He was good to me when I was a little kid, and when he found I was in trouble." The breath came pitifully in gasps. "He offered to marry me." Marilyn's fingers trembled, but she held the little cold hand warmly and tried to keep back the tears that trembled in her eyes. "He didn't want to. He just done it to be kind, but I couldn't see it. That's what we argued." Her voice grew fainter again. Marilyn, with gentle, controlled voice, pressed the little cold hand again. "Never mind, Cherry dear. It's all right." Cherry's eyes opened with renewed effort, anxiously. "You won't blame Mark? He never did nothing wrong. He's your friend." "No, Cherry, it's all right." The girl seemed to have lost consciousness again, and Marilyn wondered if she ought not to call the doctor, but suddenly Cherry screamed out, "There he is again! He's come for me! Oh, I'm going to die, and I'm afraid." Cherry clutched at Marilyn's arm and looked up with far-off gaze in which terror seemed frozen. The minister's daughter leaned farther over and gathered the fragile form of the sick girl in her arms tenderly, speaking in a soothing voice. "Listen, Cherry, don't be afraid. Jesus is here. He'll go with you." "But I'm afraid of Jesus." The sharp little voice pierced out with a shudder. "I haven't been good." "Then tell him you are sorry. You are sorry, aren't you?" "Oh, yes," the weak voice moaned. "I never meant no harm. I only wanted a little good time." The eyes had closed again, and she was almost gone. The doctor had come in, and he now gave her another spoonful of medicine. Marilyn knew the time was short. "Listen, Cherry. Say these words after me." Cherry's eyes opened again and fastened on her face eagerly. "Jesus, I'm sorry." "Jesus, I'm sorry," repeated the weak voice in almost a whisper. "Please forgive me," said Marilyn slowly, distinctly. "Please forgive," the slow voice repeated. "And save me. Save." The voice was scarcely audible. The doctor came and stood close by the bed, looking down keenly, but Cherry roused once more and looked at them, her sharp little voice stabbing out into the silence piercingly. "Is that all?" "That is all," said Marilyn with a ring in her voice. "Jesus died to take care of all the rest. You can just rest on him." "Oh." The agony went out of the pinched little face. A half smile dawned, and she sank into rest. As Marilyn went home in the dawn with the morning star beginning to pale, and the birds at their early worship, something in her own heart was singing too. Above the feeling of awe over standing at the brink of the river and seeing a little soul go wavering out, above even the wonder that she had been called to point the way, there sang in her soul a song of jubilation that Mark was exonerated from shame and disgrace. Whatever others thought, whatever she personally would always have believed, it still was great that God had given her this to make her know that her inner vision about it had been right. Perhaps, sometime, in the days that were to come, Mark would tell her about it. But there was time enough for that. Mark would perhaps come to see her this morning. She somehow felt sure that at least he would come to say he was glad she had stayed with his mother. It was like Mark to do that. He never let any little thing that was done for him or his pass unnoticed. But the morning passed and Mark did not come. The only place that Mark went was to see Billy. "Billy, old man," he said, sitting down by the edge of the bed where Billy was drowsing the early morning away, just feeling the bed and sensing Saxy down there making chicken broth, and knowing that the young robins in the apple tree under the window were growing up and flown away. "Billy, I can't keep my promise to you after all. I've got to go away. Sorry, kid, but she'll come to see you, and I want you to tell her for me all about it. I'm not forgetting it, kid, either, and you'll know all the rest of my life. You and I are buddies. Savvy, kid?" Billy looked at Mark with big, understanding eyes. There was sadness and a hunger and great self-control in that still white face that he worshipped so devotedly. All was not well with his hero yet. It came to him vaguely that perhaps Mark too had even yet something to learn, the kind of thing that was only learned by going through fire. He struggled for words to express himself, but all he could find were, "I say, Mark, why didn't you get it off your chest? It's great." Perhaps there wouldn't have been another human in Sabbath Valley, except perhaps it might have been Marilyn who would have understood that by this low-growled suggestion Billy was offering confession of sin as a remedy for his friend's ailment of soul. But Mark looked at him keenly, almost tenderly for a long minute, and shook his head, his face taking on a grayer, more hopeless look as he said, "I can't, kid. It's too late." Billy closed his eyes for a moment. He felt it wasn't quite square to see into his friend's soul that way when he was off his guard, but he understood. He had passed that way himself. It came to him that nothing he could say would make any difference. He would have liked to tell of his own experience in the courtroom and how he had suddenly known that all his efforts to right his wrong had been failures, that there was only one who could do it, but there were no words in a boy's vocabulary to say a thing like that. It sounded unreal. It had to be felt, and he found his heart kept saying over and over as he lay there waiting with closed eyes for Mark to speak, "Oh, God, why didn't you show him yourself? Why don't you show him yourself?" He wondered if Miss Lynn couldn't have shown Mark if he had only gone and talked it over with her. But Mark said it was too late. "Well, why don't you show him yourself, then? Why don't you show him yourself, God? Please!" Mark got up with a long sigh. "Well, so long, kid, till I see you again. And I won't forget, kid. You know I won't forget. And, kid, I'm leaving my gun with you. I know you'll take good care of it and not let it do any damage. You might need it, you know, to take care of your aunt, or Miss Severn, or—" "Sure," said Billy, with shining eyes, clasping the weapon that had been Mark's proud possession for several years. "Aw, gee! You hadn't ought to give me this. You might need it yourself." "No, kid, I'd rather feel that you have it. I want to leave someone here to kind of take my place, watching, you know. There'll be times—" "Sure," said Billy, a kind of glory overspreading his thin, eager face. "Aw, gee, Mark!" And long after Mark had gone and the sound of his purring engine had died away in the distance, Billy lay back with the weapon clasped to his heart and a weird kind of rhythm repeating itself over and over somewhere in his spirit. "Why don't you show him yourself, God? Why don't you show him yourself? You will. I bet you will. Yet." And was that anything like the prayer of faith translated into theological language? Aunt Saxon went up tiptoe with the broth and thought he was asleep and tiptoed down again to keep it warm a while. But Billy lay there and felt like Elisha after the mantle of the prophet Elijah had fallen upon him. It gave him a grand, solemn feeling. God and he were somehow taking Mark's place till Mark got ready to come back and do it himself. He was to take care of Sabbath Valley as far as in him lay, but more particularly of Miss Marilyn Severn. And then, suddenly, without warning, Miss Marilyn herself went away, to New York, she said, for a few weeks. She wasn't sure just how long. But there was something sad in her voice as she said it, and something white about the look she wore that made him sure she was not going to the part of New York where Mark Carter lived. Billy accepted it with a sigh. Things were getting pretty dry around Sabbath Valley for him. He didn't seem to get his pep back as fast as he had expected. For one thing, he worried a good deal, and for another, the doctor wouldn't let him play baseball nor ride a bicycle yet for quite a while. He had to go around and act just like a girl. Aw, gee, sometimes he was even glad to have Mary Little come across the street with her picture puzzles and stay with him a while. She was real good company. He had never dreamed before that girls could be as interesting. Of course, Miss Marilyn had to be a girl once, but then she was Miss Marilyn. That was different. Then, too, Billy hadn't quite forgotten that first morning that Saxy got her arms around him and cried over him glad tears, bright, sweet tears that wet his face and made him feel like crying happy tears, too. And the sudden surprising desire he felt to hug her with his well arm, and how she fell over on the bed and got to laughing because he pulled her hair down in his awkwardness and pulled her collar crooked. Aw, gee, she was just Aunt Saxy, and he had been rotten to her a lot of times, but now it was different. Somehow Saxy and he were more pals, or was it that he was the man now taking care of Saxy, and not the little boy being taken care of himself? Somehow, during those weeks he had been gone, Saxy had cried out the pink tears, and was growing smiles, and home was kinda nice after all. But he missed the bells, and nights before he got into bed he got to kneeling down regularly, and saying softly inside his heart, "Aw, gee, God, please, why ain't you make Mark understand, and why ain't you bring 'em both home?" End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Marilyn had not been in New York but a week before she met Opal. She was waiting to cross Fifth Avenue when someone leaned out of a big limousine that paused for the congestion in traffic and cried, "Why, if that isn't Miss Severn from Sabbath Valley! Get in, please, I want to see you." And Lynn, much against her will, was persuaded to get in, more because she was holding up traffic than because the woman in the limousine insisted. "I'll take you where you want to go," she said in answer to Lynn's protests, and they rolled away up the great avenue with the moving throng. "I'm dying to know what it is you're making Laurie Shafton do," said Opal eagerly. "I never saw him so much interested in anything in my life. Or is it you he's interested in? Why, he can't talk of anything else, and he's almost stopped going to the club or any of the house parties. Everybody thinks he's perfectly crazy. He won't drink any more either. He's made himself quite notorious. I believe I heard someone say the other day they hadn't even seen him smoking for a whole week. You certainly are a wonder." "You're quite mistaken," said Lynn, much amused. "I had nothing to do with Mr. Shafton's present interest, except as I happened to be the one to introduce him to it. I haven't seen him but twice since I came to New York, and then only to take him around among my babies at the settlement, and once over to the orphan's home, where I've been helping out while an old friend of mine with whom I worked in France is away with her sick sister." "For mercy's sake, you don't mean that Laurie consented to go among the poor? I heard he'd given a lot of money to fix up some buildings, but then all the best men are doing things like that now. It's quite the fad. But to go himself and see the wretched little things? Ugh! I don't see how he could. He must be quite crazy about you, I'm sure, if he did all that for you." "Oh, he seemed to want to see them," said Lynn lightly, "and he suggested many of the improvements that he is making himself. They tell me he has proved a great helper. He is on hand at all hours superintending the building himself, and everybody is delighted with him." Commented Opal, looking at Marilyn through the fringes of her eyes. "You really are a wonder. And now that you are in New York, I'm going to introduce you to our crowd. When can you come? Let's see, tomorrow is Sunday. Will you spend the evening with me tomorrow? I'll certainly show you a good time. We're going to motor to—" But Lynn was shaking her head decidedly. "I couldn't possibly spare a minute, thank you. I'm only out on an errand now. I'm needed every instant at the home." "For mercy's sake, hire someone to take your place then. I want you. You'll be quite a sensation, I assure you. Don't worry about clothes if you haven't anything along. You can wear one of my evening dresses. We're almost of a size." "No," said Lynn, smiling. "It simply isn't possible. And anyway, don't you remember Sabbath Valley? I don't go out to play Sunday nights, you know." "Oh, but this is New York. You can't bring Sabbath Valley notions into New York." Lynn smiled again. "You can if they are a part of you," she said. "Come in and see how nicely I'm fixed." Opal looked up at the beautiful building before which they were stopping. "Why, where is this?" she asked, astonished. "I thought you were down in the slums somewhere." "This is a home for little orphan children kept up by the Salvation Army. Come in a minute and see it." Following a whim of curiosity, Opal came in and was led down a long hall to a great room where were 100 tiny children sitting on little chairs in a big circle playing kindergarten games. The children were dressed in neat, pretty frocks such as any beloved children would wear, with bright hair ribbons and neckties, and each with an individuality of its own. The room was sunny and bright, with a great playhouse at one end, with real windows and furniture in it, and all sorts of toboggan slides and swings and kiddie cars and everything to delight the soul of a child. On a wide space between two windows, painted on the plaster in soft, wonderful coloring, blended into the gray tint of the wall, there glowed a life-size painting of the Christ surrounded by little children, climbing upon his knees and listening to him as he smiled and talked to them. Opal paused in the doorway and looked at the picture first, shyly, shamedly, as though it were no place for her to enter, then curiously at the little children with a kind of wistful yearning, as if here was something she had missed of her own fault. Lynn called out a charming baby and made her shake hands and bow and say a few listening, smiling words. Opal turned to Lynn with a strangely subdued look and spoke in a moved tone. "I guess you're right," she said. "You wouldn't fit at my company. You're different. But someday I'm coming after you and bring you home all by yourself for a little while. I want to find out what it is you have that I need." Then she turned with swift steps and went down the hall and out the door to her waiting limousine, and Lynn smiled wonderingly as she saw her whirled away into the world again. Lynn had not seen Mark. Laurie Shafton had called upon her many times since those 2 trips they had taken around the settlements and looking over his condemned property, but she had been busy or out somewhere on her errands of mercy, so that Laurie had got very little satisfaction for his trouble. But Mark had seen Lynn once, just once, and that the first time she had gone with Laurie Shafton as they were getting out of his car in front of one of his buildings. Mark had slipped into the doorway out of sight and watched them, and after they passed into the building had gone on, his face whiter and sadder than before. That was all. Marilyn was to spend only a month in New York, as at first planned, but the month lengthened into 6 weeks before the friend whose place she was taking was able to return, and 2 days before Marilyn was expecting to start home there came a telephone message from her mother. "Lynn, dear, Mrs. Carter is very low, dying, we think, and we must find Mark at once. There is not a minute to lose if he wants to see her alive. It is a serious condition brought on by excitement. Mrs. Harricut went there to call yesterday while everybody else was at Ladies' Aid, and Lynn, she told her about Mark. Now, Lynn, can you get somebody to go with you and find Mark right away? Get him to come home at once. Here is the last address he gave, but they have no telephone, and we dare not wait for a telegram. See what you can do, quickly." It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when this message came. Lynn put on a uniform of dark blue serge and a poke bonnet that was at her disposal whenever she had need of protection, and hurried out. She found the address after some trouble, but was told that the young gentleman was out. No one seemed to know when he would return. 2 or 3 other lodgers gathered curiously, one suggesting a restaurant where he might be found, another a club where he sometimes went, and a third laughed and called out from halfway up the stairs, "You'll find him at the cabaret around the corner by 10 o'clock tonight, if you don't find him sooner. He's always there when he's in town." Sick at heart, Lynn went on her way, trying carefully each place that had been suggested, but finding no trace of him. She met with only deference for her uniform wherever she went, and without the slightest fear she traveled through streets at night that she would scarcely have liked to pass alone in the daytime in her ordinary garb. But all the time her heart was praying that she might find Mark before it was too late. She tried every little clue that was given her, hoping against hope that she would not have to search for her old friend in a cabaret, such as she knew that place around the corner must be. But it was almost 10 o'clock and she had not found Mark. She went back to the first address once more, but he had not come, and so she finally turned her steps toward the cabaret. Sadly, with her heart beating wildly, hoping yet fearing to find him, she paused just inside the doors and looked around, trying to get used to the glare and blare, the jazz and the smoke, and the strange lax garb, and to differentiate the individuals from the crowd. Food and drink, smoke and song, wine and dance, flesh and odd perfumes. Her soul sank within her, and she turned bewildered to a servitor at the door. "I wonder, is there any way to find a special person here? I have a very important message." The man bent his head deferentially as though to one from another world. "Who did you want, miss?" "Mr. Mark Carter," said Marilyn, feeling the color rise in her cheeks at letting even this waiter see that she expected to find Mark Carter here. The man looked up, puzzled. He was rather new at the place. He summoned another passing one of his kind. "Carter? Carter?" the man said thoughtfully. "Oh, yes, he's the guy that never drinks. He's over there at the table in the far corner with the little dancer lady." The waiter pointed and Lynn looked. "Would you like me to call him, miss?" Lynn reflected quickly. Perhaps he might try to evade her. She must run no risks. "Thank you, I will go get him," she said, and straight through the maze of candle-lighted tables and whirling dancers, in her quiet, holy garb, she threaded her way hastily as one might have walked over quicksands with her eye fixed upon Mark. She came and stood beside him before he looked up and saw her, and then he lifted his eyes from the face of the girl with whom he was talking and rose suddenly to his feet, his face gone white as death, his eyes dark with disapproval and humiliation. "Marilyn!" His voice was shaking. He knew her instantly in spite of poke bonnet and uniform. She was the one thought present with him all the while, perhaps for years wherever he had been. But he did not look glad to see her. Instead, it was as if his soul shrank shamedly from her clear eyes as she looked at him. Marilyn had not known what she was going to say to him when she found him. She did not stop to think now. "Mark, your mother wants you. She is dying. You must come quick or she will be gone." Afterwards she repeated over the words to herself again and again as one might do penance, blaming herself that she had not softened it, made it more easy for him to bear. Yet at the time it seemed the only thing there was to say, at such a time, in such a place. But at the stricken look upon his face her heart grew tender. "Come," she said compassionately, "we will go." They went out into the night, and it was as if they had suddenly changed places, as if she were the protector and he the led. She guided him the quickest way. There was only a chance that they might catch the midnight train, but there was that chance. Into the subway she dived, he following, and breathless they brought up at the Pennsylvania station at their train gate as it was being closed, and hurried through. All through that agonized night they spoke but few words, those two who had been so much to one another through long happy years. "But you are not going too?" He spoke suddenly, roused from his daze as the train started. "Yes, I am going too, of course, Mark," she said. He bowed his head and almost groaned. "I am not worthy, Marilyn." "That has nothing to do with it," said Marilyn sadly. "It never will have anything to do with it. It never did." Mark looked at her with harrowed eyes and dropped his gaze. So he sat, hour after hour, as the train rushed along through the night, and Marilyn, with head slightly bent and meek face, beneath the poke bonnet with its crimson band, was praying as she rode. Praying in other words the prayer that Billy murmured beside his bed every night. But Billy was not lying in his bed that night, sleeping the sleep of the just. He was up and on the job. He was sitting in the Carter kitchen, keeping up the fires, making a cup of tea for the nurse and the doctor, running the endless little errands, up to the parsonage for another hot water bag, down to the drugstore for more aromatic spirits of ammonia, fixing a newspaper shade to dull the light in the hall, and praying, all the time praying. "Oh, God, ain't you going to leave her stay till Mark gets here? Ain't you got to send Mark quick? You know best, I s'pose, but ain't you going to?" And then, "Aw, gee, I wish Miss Lynn was here." In the chill before the dawning, the two stepped down from the train at a little flag station 3 miles from Sabbath Valley on the upper road that ran along the ridge. They had prevailed upon the conductor to let them off there. Mark had roused enough for that. And now that they were out in the open country, he seemed to come to himself. He took care of Lynn, making her take his arm, guiding her into the smooth places, helping her over rough places. He asked a few questions, too. How did she know of his mother's condition? How long had she been this way? Had she any idea that his mother's heart was affected? Did she have a shock? Lynn did not tell all she knew. It was hard enough without that. He need not know that it was the knowledge of his disgrace that had brought her to the brink of death. So, walking and talking almost as in the old days, they passed into Sabbath Valley and down the street, and Christy McMurtry, listening perhaps for this very thing, crept from her bed in her long flannel nightgown and big ruffled nightcap, and looked out the window to see them go by. "Bless them!" she breathed, and crept back to her bed again. She had nursed all day, and all the night before, and would have been there too tonight, only Mary Rafferty took things in her own hands, and had her go to bed, herself taking charge. Mrs. Duncannon was there too. There really was no need of her, but Christy could not sleep, and after they passed she rose and dressed and slipped down the street with the hot porridge that had been cooking on the stove all night, and the makings of a good breakfast in her basket on her arm. Mark Carter reached home in time to take his mother in his arms and bid her good-bye. That was all. She roused at his voice and touch, and reached out her little pretty hands toward him. He took her in his big, strong arms and held her, kissed her with tender lips, and she drew a beautiful smile of perfect content and slipped away, with the graying golden hair straying out over Mark's sleeve to the pillow in a long curl, and a quiver of her last smile on the pretty curve of her lips, as if this was all that she had waited for, the little pretty girl that had gone to school so long ago with golden hair and a smile. Billy, standing awed in the doorway, whither he had come to say there was more hot water ready, caught the vision of her face, remembered those school days, and felt a strange constriction in his throat. Some day Saxy would have to go like that, and would show the little girl in her face too, and he maybe would have to hold her so and think of how cross he had been. Aw, gee, what a queer thing life was anyhow. Well, hadn't his prayer been answered? Didn't Mark get here in time? Well, anyhow, it was likely better for Mrs. Carter to go, but it was rotten for Mark. Aw, gee, Mark, was this the way he had to learn it? Aw, gee. Well, God would have to show him. He couldn't dope it out anyhow. During the days that followed, Mark hardly stirred from the side of the pretty little clay that had been his mother, except when they forced him for a little while. An hour before the service, he knelt alone beside the casket, and the door opened, and Marilyn came softly in, closing it behind her. She walked over to Mark and laid her hand on his hand that rested over his mother's among the flowers, and she knelt beside him and spoke softly, "Oh, God, help Mark find the light." Then the soul of Mark Carter was shaken to the depths, and suddenly his self-control, which had been so great, was broken. His strong shoulders began to shake with sobs, silent, hard sobs of a man who knows he has sinned, and tears, scalding tears from the depths of his self-contained nature. Marilyn reached her arm out across his shoulders as a mother would try to protect a child, and lifted her face against his, wet with tears, and kissed him on the forehead. Then she left him and went quietly out. "Well," said Mrs. Harricut with satisfaction as she walked home after the funeral with Christy McMurtry, "I'm glad to see that Mark Carter has a little proper feeling at last. If he'd showed it sooner, his mom might have been in the land of the living yet." Christy's stern face grew sterner as she set her teeth and bit her tongue before replying. Then she said with more burr than usual in her speech, "Martha Harricut, there's na land that's so living as the land where Mark Carter's mither has ganged tae, but there's them that has mair blame to bear for her gain than her barny big son, I'm thinking, and there's them in this town that agrees with me too, I know full well." Down in front of the parsonage, the minister had his arm around Mark Carter's shoulders and was urging him, "Son, come in. We want you. Mother wants you. I want you. Marilyn wants you. Come, son, come." But Mark steadily refused, his eyes downcast, his face sad, withdrawn. "Mr. Severn, I'll come tomorrow. I can't come tonight. I must go home and think." "And will you promise me you will not leave without coming, Mark?" asked the minister sadly when he saw that it was no use. "Yes, I will promise." Mark wrung the minister's hand in a warm grip that said many things he could not speak, and then he passed on to his lonely home. But it was not entirely empty. Billy was there, humbly, silently, with dog-true eyes and a grown-up patient look on his tired young face. He had the coffee pot on the stove and hot sausages cooking on the stove, and a lot of Saxy's doughnuts and a pie on the table. Billy stayed all night with Mark. He knew Saxy would understand. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. In the middle of the night, the fire bell rang out wildly. 3 minutes later, Mark and Billy were flying down the street, with Tom McMurtry and Jim Rafferty close after, and a host of other tried and true, with the minister on the other side of the street. The fire company of Sabbath Valley held a proud record, and the minister was an active member of it. The fire was up in the plush mill and had already spread to a row of shackly tenements that the owners of the mills had put up to house the foreign labor that they had put in. They called them apartment houses, but they were so much on the order of the city tenements of several years back that it made Lynn's heart ache when she went there to see a little sick child one day. Right in the midst of God's trees and mountains, a man for money had built a death trap, tall and grim and dark, with small rooms and tiny windows, built it with timbers too small for safety and windows too few for ventilation, and here an increasing number of families were herded in spite of the complaint of the town. "I been thinking it would come," said Tom as he took long strides. "It's the apartments for sure, Jimmy. We'd better beat it. There'll be only a minute or so to get the chiller out before the whole thing's smoke." They were all there, the doctor, the blacksmith, the postmaster, the men from the mills and the banks and the stores. Economy heard the bells, for Marilyn had hurried to the church and added the fire chime to the call and came over with their little chemical engine. Monopoly heard and hurried their brand new hook and ladder up the valley road, but the fire had been eating long in the heart of the plush mill and laughed at their puny streams of water forced up from the creek below, laughed at the chemicals flung in its face like drops of rain on a sizzling red-hot stove. It licked its lips over the edge of the cliff on which it was built and cracked its jaws as it devoured the mill, window by window, section by section, leaping across with an angry red tongue to the first tall building by its side. The fire had worked cunningly, for it had crept out of sight to the lower floors all along the row and unseen, unknown, had bitten a hold on each of those doomed buildings, till when the men arrived it went roaring ghoulishly up the high, narrow stairs, cutting off all escape from above, and making entrance below impossible. Up at the windows the doomed people stood, crying, praying, wringing their hands, and some losing their heads and trying to jump out. The firemen were brave and worked wonders. They flung up ladders in the face of the flames. They risked their lives every step they took and brought out one after another, working steadily, grimly, rapidly. And none were braver among them all than Mark Carter and the minister, each working on the very top of a tall, treacherous ladder in the face of constant danger, bringing out one after another until the last. The next house to the mill had caved in, and Mark had come down just in time with an old woman who was bedridden and had been forgotten. The workers had paused an instant as the horrible sound of falling timbers rent through the other noises of that horrible night, and then hurried to increase their vigilance. There were people in the top floor of the next house, and it would go next. Then the word went forth that no more must go up the ladder. The roof was about to fall in, and a young mother shrieked, my baby! She's up in the bed! I thought Bob had her, but he couldn't get up." Mark Carter looked at her sharply. "Which window?" he asked, and was up the ladder before detaining hands could reach him, and Billy, sliding under the arm of the fire chief, swung up just behind. The crowd watched breathless as they mounted round after round, Aunt Saxon standing with a shawl over her head and gasping aloud, "Oh, Willie!" and then standing still in fear and pride, the tears streaming down a smiling countenance on which the red glare of the fire shone. The ladder was set crazily against the flaming window and swayed with their weight. Every step seemed as if it would topple the building, yet the ladder held, and Mark sprang through the blazing window out of sight. It seemed an eternity till he returned, bringing a tiny bundle with him and handing it out to Billy waiting below. The boy received, as it had been a holy honor, that little bundle of humanity handed through the fire and came solemnly down amid the breathless gaze of the crowd. But when they looked to the top again, Mark had disappeared. The murmur of horror went round the throng, for the flames were licking and snapping, and the roof seemed to vibrate and quiver like a human thing. Then before anyone could stop him or even saw what he was going to do, the minister sprang forward up the ladder like a cat, 2 rounds at a time, 3. He dashed through the fire and was gone. For an instant it seemed that the people would go mad with the horror of it. Those 2! Even the fire chief paused and seemed petrified. It was Billy who sensed the thing to do. "Get your canvas, man? Are you asleep?" And instantly a great piece of canvas was spread and lifted, but the building tottered, the flames ate on, and the window seemed entirely enveloped. The moment lasted too long for the hearts that waited. A groan rent the air. Then suddenly a breath seemed to part the flames, and they saw the minister coming forward with Mark in his arms. It was just at this instant that Lynn came flying down the street. She had kept the bells going till she knew all the help had come from a distance, and now she was coming to see if there was anything else for her to do. There before her she saw her father standing in that awful setting of fire, with Mark limp and lifeless in his arms. Then the flames licked up and covered the opening once more. Oh, God! Were they both gone? Only for an instant more the suspense lasted, and then the cataclysm of fire came. The roof fell, carrying with it the floors as it went, down, 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 shuddering like a human thing as it went, the rain of fire pouring up and around in great blistering flakes, and scorching the onlookers and lighting their livid faces as they stood transfixed with horror at the sight. The canvas fluttered uselessly down, and fire showered thick upon it. Timbers and beams crumbled like paper things and were no more. The whole flimsy structure had caved in. Paralyzed with terror and sorrow, the firemen stood gazing, and suddenly a boy's voice rang out, "Aw, gee, get to work there! What are you doing? Playing dominoes? Turn that hose over there. That's where they fell. Say you, Jim, get that fire hook and lift that beam. Aw, gee, you ain't going to let 'em die, are ya? Them too!" Billy had seized a heavy hose and was turning it on a central spot, and Jim Rafferty caught the idea and turned his stream that way, and into the fire went the brave men, one and another, instantly, cheerfully, devotedly, the men who loved the two men in there. Dead or alive, they should be got out if it killed them all. They would all die together. The fire chief stood close to Billy and shouted his directions, and Billy worked with the tallest of them, black, hoarse, and weary. It seemed ages. It was hours. It was a miracle. But they got those two men out alive, blackened and bruised and broken, burned almost beyond recognition, but they were alive. They found them lying close to the front wall, their faces together, Mark's body covered by the minister's. Tender hands brought them forth and carried them gently on stretchers out from the circle of danger and noise and smoke. Eagerly they were ministered to with oil and old linen and stimulants. There were doctors from Economy and one from Monopoly, besides the Sabbath Valley doctor, who was like a brother to the minister and had known Mark since he was born. They worked as if their lives depended on it, till all that loving skill could do was done. Billy, his eyelashes and brows gone, half his hair singed off, one eye swollen shut, and great blisters on his hands and arms, sat huddled and shivering on the ground between the two stretchers. The fire was still going on, but he was all in. The only thing left he could do was to bow his bruised face on his trembling knees and pray, "Oh, God, ain't you going to let him live? Please!" They carried Mark to the Saxon cottage and laid him on Billy's bed. There was no lack of nurses. Aunt Saxon and Christy McMurtry, the Duncannons and Mary Rafferty, Jim too, and Tom. It seemed that everybody claimed the honors. The minister was across the street in the little house. They dared not move him farther. Of the two, the case of the minister was the most hopeless. He had borne the burden of the fall. He had been struck by the falling timbers. His body had been a cover for the younger man. In every way the minister had not saved himself. The days that followed were full of anxiety. There were a few others more or less injured in the fire, for there had been fearless work, and no one had spared himself. But the two who hung at the point of death for so long were laid on the hearts of the people, because they were dear to almost everyone. Little neighborhood prayer meetings sprang up quietly here and there, beginning at Duncannon's. The neighbor on either side would come in, and they would just drop down and pray for the minister and for that other dear brave brother. Then the Littles heard of it and called in a few friends. One night, when both sufferers were at the crisis and there seemed little hope for the minister, Christy McMurtry called in the Raffertys, and they were just on the point of kneeling down when Mrs. Harricut came to the door. She had been crying. She said she and her husband hadn't slept a wink the night before. They were so anxious for the minister. Christy looked at her severely, but remembering the commands about loving and forgiving, relented. "Well, then, come on, Ben, and pray. Tom, you go call her husband. This is na time for holding grudges, but mind, woman, if ye come here to pray, ye must pray with as much fervour for the healing o' Mark Carter as ye do for the minister. He's beloved of the Lord too, and the minister nigh give his life for him." And Mrs. Harricut put up her apron to her eyes and entered the little haircloth parlor, while Tom with a wry face went after the elder. The elder proved that underneath all his narrowness and prejudice he had a grain of the real truth, for he prayed with fervor that the Lord would cleanse their hearts from all prejudice and open their minds to see with heavenly vision that they might have power in prayer for the healing of the two men. So through the whole little village breaches were healed, and a more loving feeling prevailed because the bond of anxiety and love held them all together and drew them nearer to their God. At last the day came when Mark, struggling up out of the fiery pit of pain, was able to remember. Pain, fire, flame, choking gases, smoke, remorse, despair. It was all vague at first, but out of it came the memory slowly. There had been a fire. He had gone back up the ladder after Mrs. Blim's baby. He remembered groping for the child in the smoke-filled room, bringing it blindly through the hall and back to the window where the ladder was, but that room had all been in flames. He had wished for a wet cloth across his face. He could feel again the licking of the fire as he passed the doorway. A great weight had been on his chest. His heart seemed bursting. His head had reeled, and he had come to the window just in time. Someone had taken the child. Was it Billy? Or we would have fallen. He did fall. The memory pieced itself out bit by bit. He remembered thinking that he had entered the city of fire literally at last. The minarets, already he seemed to descry, gleaming vermilion as if they from the fire had issued. It was curious how those old words from Dante had clung in his memory. Eternal fire that inward burns. He thought he was feeling now in his body what his soul had experienced for long months past. It was the natural ending, the thing he had known he was coming to all along, the road of remorse and despair, a fire that goes no more out, and this would last forever now. Then some strong arm had lifted him. God's air swept in, and for an instant there seemed hope, but only that little breath of respite, and there came a cry like myriads of lost souls. They were falling down through the fire, with fire above, below, around, everywhere, down, an abysmal eternity of fire, till his seared soul writhed from his tortured body and stood aside, looking on at himself. There he lay, the Mark Carter that had started with life so fair, friends, prospects, so proud that he was a man, that he could conquer and be brave, so blessed with opening life and heaven's high call. And then, in one day, he had sinned and lost it all, and there he lay, a white upturned face. That was himself, lying there with face illuminated by the fire, and men would call him dead. But he would not be dead. He would be living on with that inward fire, gnawing at his vitals, telling him continually what he might have been, and showing him what high heaven was that he had and lost. He saw it now. He had deliberately thrown away that heaven that had been his. He saw that hell was hell because he made it so. It was not God that put him there, but he had chosen there to go, and still the fire burned on and scorched his poor soul back into the body to be tortured more. The long weeks upon that bed seemed like an infinite space of burning, rosy, oily flames poured upward from a lake of fire, down through which he had been falling in constant and increasing agony. And now at last he seemed to be flung upon this peaceful shore, where things were cool and soothing for a brief respite, that he might look off at where he had been floating on that molten lake of fire, and understand it all before he was flung back. And it was all so very real. With his eyes still closed, he could hear the rushing of the flames that still seemed ascending in columns out a little way from shore. He could see through his eyelids the rosy hue of livid waters. Of course it was all a hallucination, and he was coming to himself, but he had a feeling that when he was fully awake it would be even more terrible than now. Two grim figures, remorse and despair, seemed waiting at either hand above his bed to companion him again when he could get more strength to recognize them. And so he lay thus between life and death, and faced what he had done. Hours and hours he faced it, when they knew not if he was conscious yet, going over and over again those sins which he knew had been the beginning of all his walk away from hope. On through the night and into the next morning he lay thus, sometimes drowsing, but most of the time alert and silent. It was a bright and sparkling morning. There was a tang of winter in the air. The leaves were gone from the apple trees at the window, and the bare branches tapped against the waterspout like children playing with a rattle. A dog barked joyously, and a boy on the street shouted out to another, "Oh, to be a boy once more!" And suddenly Mark knew Billy was sitting there. He opened his eyes and smiled. There were bandages around his face, but he smiled stiffly, and Billy knew he was smiling. "Kid," he said hoarsely from out the bandages, "this is God's world." It seemed to be a great thought that he had been all this time grasping and had to utter. "Sure," said Billy in a low, happy growl. A long time after this, it might have been the next day, he wasn't sure, or perhaps only a few minutes, he came at another truth. "Kid, you can't get away from God, even when you try." "I'll say not," said Billy. "But when you've sinned," speculatively, "you gotta get it off your chest." "You mean confess?" "Sure thing. Miss Lynn tells us in Sunday school about a fella in the Bible got down to eatin' with the pigs in a far country, and when he come to himself, he thought about his father's servants, and he said, 'I'll get up and beat it home and say I'm sorry.'" "I know," said Mark, and was still the rest of the day. But the next morning he asked the doctor how soon he might get up. This was the first real indication that Mark was on the mend, and the doctor smiled with satisfaction. He meant to take off some of the bandages that morning. That afternoon, with his head unswathed, Mark began to ask questions. Before that, he had seemed to take everything for granted. "Billy, where's the minister?" For Billy have never left his idol side except when Aunt Saxon needed him to help. "Oh, he's up to the parsonage," responded Billy carelessly. "But why hasn't he been to see me, kid? Why, Hasn't been feelin' very good." Billy's voice was brisk, as if it wasn't a matter of much moment. Mark turned his thoughtful gray eyes steadily on Billy. "Now look here, kid. I'm well, and there's no further need to camouflage. Billy, is the minister dead?" "Not on your tintype he ain't dead." "Well, is he hurt?" "Well, some," Billy admitted cheerfully. "Kid, look me in the eye." Billy raised a saucy eye as well masked as Mark's own could be on occasion. "Kid, how much is he hurt? Tell me the truth. If you don't, I'll get right up and go and see." "I'll tell the world you won't," said Billy, rising lazily and taking a gentle, menacing step toward the bed. "Kid?" "Well, he's some hurt, but he's getting along fine now. He'll be all right." "How'd he get hurt?" "Oh, the fire, same as you." "How?" insisted Mark. "Oh, he went up again after a fella when it was too late." "Billy, was it me?" "Uh-huh," nodded Billy. Mark was so still that Billy was frightened. When he looked up worried, he saw that a great tear had escaped out from under the lashes, which were growing nicely now, and had rolled down Mark's cheek. Mark crying! In consternation, Billy knelt beside the bed. "Aw, gee, Mark, now don't you feel like that. He's getting all right now, they hope, and gee, he was great. You ought to seen him." "Tell me about it," said Mark huskily. "He just ran up that there ladder when it was shaking like a leaf and the wall beginning to buckle under it, and he picked you up. For a minute there the flames kind of blew back, and we seen you both, and then the roof caved, and you all went down. But when we got you out, he was lying right on top of you, with his arms spread out, trying to cover you. Gee, it was great. Everybody was just as still, like he was preaching." After a long time, Mark said, "Billy, did you ever hear the words, 'Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends'?" "Yep," said Billy. "That's in the Bible, I think, if 'tain't in Shakespeare. Miss Lynn said it over last Sunday. She says a lot of things from Shakespeare sometimes, and I kind of get 'em mixed." But Mark did not talk any more that day. He had a great deal to think about. But so did Billy, for looking out the window in the direction of the parsonage, he had sighted the big Shafton car stopping before the door that morning. "Aw, gee," he said, "that sissy guy again. Now how am I going to get rid of him this time? Gee, just when Mark's getting well, too. If life ain't just one thing after another." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. It was a bright, frosty morning in the edge of winter when at last they let Mark go to see the minister, and Billy took care that no hint of the Shafton car should reach his knowledge. Slowly, gravely, he escorted Mark down the street and up the parsonage steps. The minister was lying on a couch in the living room, and there was a low chair drawn up nearby, with a book open at the place, and a bit of fluffy sewing on the low table beside it. Mark looked hungrily about for the owner of the gold thimble, but there was no sign of either Mrs. Severn or Marilyn about. There was a bandage over the minister's eyes. They hadn't told Mark about that yet. The minister held out a groping hand with his old sweet smile and hearty welcoming voice. "Well, son, you've come at last. Beat me to it, didn't you? I'm glad. That was fair. Young blood, you know." Mark knelt down by the couch with his old friend's hand held fast. Billy had faded into the landscape and out the front steps somewhere, and was even now settling down for an extended wait. If this interview went well, he might hope to get a little rest and catch up on sports sometime soon. It all depended on this. Mark put up his other hand and touched the bandage. "Father," he said, "Father," and broke down. "Father, I have sinned," he said brokenly. The minister's arm went lovingly up across the young man's shoulders. "Son, have you told your heavenly Father that?" he asked gently. "I've tried," said Mark. "I'm not sure that he heard." "Oh, he heard," said the minister with a ring of joy in his voice. "While you were a great way off, he came to meet you, son." "You don't know yet," said Mark, lifting a white, sad face. "If you've told him, I'll trust you, son. It's up to you whether you tell me or not." "It's your right to know, sir. I want you to know. I cannot rest again until you do." "Then tell." The minister's hand folded down tenderly over the boy's, and so kneeling beside the couch, Mark told his story. "I must begin by telling you that I have always loved Marilyn." "I know," said the minister with a pressure on the hand he covered. One day I heard someone telling Mrs. Severn that I was not good enough for her." "I know," said the minister again. "You know?" said Mark in surprise. "Yes, go on." "I went away and thought it over. I felt as if I would die. I was mad and hurt clear through, but after I thought it over, I saw that all she had said was true. I wasn't good enough. There was a great deal of pride mixed with it all, of course. I've seen that since, but I wasn't good enough. Nobody was. Lynn is wonderful. But I was just a common, insignificant nobody, not fit to be her mate. I knew it. I could see just how things were going, too. I saw you didn't realize it, you nor Mrs. Severn. I knew Marilyn cared, but I thought she didn't realize it either, and I saw it was up to me. If she wasn't to have to suffer by being parted from me when she grew older, I must teach her not to care before she knew she cared. For days I turned it over in my mind. Many nights I lay awake all night or walked out on the hills, threshing it all over again. And I saw another thing. I saw that if it was so hard for me, then when I was not much more than a kid, it would be harder for her if I let her grow up caring. And then we had to be parted, so I decided to make the break. The day I made the decision, I went off in the hills and stayed all day thinking it out. And then I looked up in the sky and told God I was done with him. I had prayed and prayed that he would make a way out of this trouble for me, and he hadn't done anything about it, and I felt that he was against me too. So when I had done that, I felt utterly reckless. I didn't care what happened to me, and I decided to go to the bad as fast as I could. I felt it would be the best way, too, to make Marilyn get over being fond of me. So I went down to Monopoly that night and looked up a fellow that had been coaching the teams for a while and was put out by the association because he was rotten. He had always made a fuss over me, wanted to make a big player out of me, and I knew he would be glad to see me. He was. He took me out to supper that night and gave me liquor to drink. You know I had never touched a drop, never had intended to as long as I lived. But when he offered it to me, I took it down as if I had been used to it. I didn't care. I wanted to do all the wrong I could. I drank again, and I must have got pretty drunk. I remember the crowd laughed at me a great deal, and they brought some girls around. It makes me sick to think of it now. We went to a place and danced. I didn't know how, but I danced anyway, and there was more drinking. I don't remember things very distinctly. I did whatever the coach said, and he had been going a pretty good pace himself. That night... His voice choked with shame, and it seemed as though he could not go on, but the minister's clasp was steady, and the boy gathered courage and went on. That night, we went to a house of shame. He dropped his head and groaned. The minister did not attempt to break the pause that followed. He knew the struggle that was going on in the bitterness of the young man's soul. He maintained that steady hand clasp. In the morning, when I came to myself, he went on, I knew what I had done. I had cut myself off forever from all that made life worthwhile. I would never be worthy again to even speak to you all whom I loved so much. I would never be able to look myself in the face again even. I was ashamed. I had given up God and love and everything worthwhile. That was when I went away to New York. Mother tried to stop me, but I would go. I tried when I got to New York to plunge into a wild life, but it didn't attract me. I had to force myself. Besides, I had resolved that whatever came, wherever I went, I could not drink, and I would keep clean. I thought that by so doing I might in time at least win back my self-respect. Later I conceived the idea of trying to save others from a life of shame. I did succeed in helping some to better ways, I think, both men and girls, but I only won a worse reputation at home for it, and I'm not sure I did much good. I only know I walked in hell from morning to night, and in time I came to dwell among lost souls. It seemed the only place that I belonged. You remember when you read us Dante, Thou who through the city of fire alive art passing? You used to preach in church about beginning the eternal life now and making a little heaven below. I'm sure that it is as true of hell. I began my eternal life 5 years ago, but it was in hell, and I shall go on living in that fire of torture forever, apart from all love. I tried to get out by doing good to others, but it was of no avail. I never thought to tell you this, but something made me after you gave your life for me. And had you forgotten, said the minister tenderly, that the blood of Jesus Christ his Son cleanseth us from all sin, and that he said, Come now, and let us reason together, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow? I gave up all right to that when I gave up God on the mountain. But God did not give up you, said the minister. Do you think a true father would cast out a child because it got angry and shook its fists in his face? You will find him again when you search for him with all your heart. You have told him you were sorry, and he has promised to forgive. You can't save yourself, but he can save you. Now, son, go and tell Marilyn everything." "Do you mean it, Father?" "I mean it, son. The doctor is coming by and by to take off these bandages, and I want the first thing that my eyes rest upon, after my dear wife's face, to be the faces of you two, my beloved children." Sabbath Valley lay tucked warm and white beneath a blanket of snow. All the week it had been coming down in great white flakes of especially sorted sizes, filling the air mightily with winter clean and deep. Here in the fastness of the hills, it seemed that the treasure troves of the sky had been opened to make all beautiful and quiet while winter passed that way. Lone Valley was almost obliterated, pierced with sharp pine trees in bunches here and there, like a flock of pins in a pincushion, and the hills rose gently on either side like a vast amphitheater done in white and peopled thick with trees and heavy white firs. The highway was almost impassable for a day or two, but the state snowplow passed over as soon as the snow stopped falling, and left a white pavement with white walls either side. The tunnel through the mountains was only a black dot in the vast whiteness, and Pleasant Valley Station wore a heavy cap of snow dripping down in lavish fringes edged with icicles. The agent's little shanty up the mountain was buried out of sight behind a snowdrift and had to be dug out from the back, and no lake train ran any more. The express was 5 hours late. Stark Mountain loomed white against the sky, and over in Sabbath Valley, the night it stopped snowing, all the villagers were out shoveling their walks and calling glad nothings back and forth as they flung the white stardust from their shovels, and little children came out with rubber boots and warm leggings and wallowed in the beauty. The milkman got out an old sleigh and strung a line of bells around his horse. The boys and girls hurried up the mountain to their slide with homemade sleds and laughing voices, and the moon came up looking sweetly from a sudden clearing sky. Over in the church, the windows shone with light, and the bells were ringing out the old sweet songs the villagers loved. Marilyn was at the organ, and Mark by her side. In the body of the church, willing hands were working, setting up the tall hemlocks that Tom and Jim had brought in from the mountain, till the little church was fragrant and literally lined with lacy beauty, reminding one of ancient worship in the woods. Holly wreaths were hanging in the windows everywhere, and ropes of ground pine and laurel festooned from every pillar and corner and peak of roof. Laurie Shafton had sent a great coffer of wonderful roses, and the country girls were handling them with awe, banking them round the pulpit and trailing them over the rail of the little choir loft, wonderful roses from another world, the world that Marilyn Severn might have married into if she had chosen. And there sat Marilyn, as indifferent as if they were dandelions, praising the trees that had been set up, delighting in their slender tops that rose like miniature spires all around the wall, drawing in the sweetness of their winter spicy breath, and never saying a word about the roses. "Roses? Oh, yes, they look all right, girls. Just put them wherever you fancy. I'll be suited. But aren't those trees too beautiful for words?" When the work was done, they trooped out noisily into the moonlight, bright like day, only with a beauty that was almost unearthly in its radiance. The others went on down the street, calling gay words back and forth, but Mark and Marilyn lingered, bearing a wreath of laurel, and stepping deep into the whiteness, went over to the white piled mound where they had laid Mrs. Carter's body to rest, and Mark stooped down and pressed the wreath down into the snow upon the top. "Dear little mother," he said brokenly, "she loved pretty things, and I meant to give her so many of them sometime to make up." "But she'll be glad," said Marilyn softly. "We loved each other very much." "Yes, she'll be glad," he answered. "She often tried to find out why I never went to the parsonage any more. Poor little mother. That was her deepest disappointment. Yes, she'll be glad." When morning came, it seemed as though the very glory of God was spread forth on Sabbath Valley for display. There it lay, a shining gem of a little white town in the white velvet cup of the valley, dazzling and resplendent, the hills rising round about reflecting more brightness and etched with fringes of fine branches, each burdened with a line of heavy furry white. Against the clear blue sky the bell tower rose, and from its arches the bells rang forth a wedding song. Marilyn in her white robes, with a long white veil of rare old lace handed down through the generations, falling down the back and fastened about her forehead, and with a slim little rope of pearls, also an heirloom, was ringing her own wedding bells, with Mark by her side, while the villagers gathered outside the door waiting for the wedding march to begin before they came in. The minister and his wife stood back in his little study behind the pulpit, watching their two with loving eyes, and down by the front door stood Billy in a new suit, with his hair very wet and licked back from an almost crimson countenance, waiting the word to fling open the door and let the congregation in. Dum, diddy-dum, 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 dum, 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 da-dum, dum, began the organ, and Billy flung the portals wide and stood aside on the steps to let the throng pass in, his eyes shining as if they would say, "Aw, gee, ain't this great?" And just at that moment, wallowing through the snow with the air of having come from the North Pole, there arrived a great car and drew up to the door, and Laurie Shafton jumped anxiously out and flung open the door for his passengers. "Aw, gee, that fish! What do you want to come here for? The great chump! Don't he know he ain't in it?" Billy watched in lofty scorn from his high step and decided to hurry in and not have to show any honors to that sissy guy. Then out from the car issued Opal, done in furs from brow to shoe and looking eagerly about her, and following her a big, handsome, sporty man almost twice her age, looking curiously interested, as if he had come to a shrine to worship Opal's husband. Billy stared, and then remembering that the wedding march was almost over and that he might be missing something. "Aw, gee, what do I care? He ain't little Apples now, anyhow. He couldn't have bought her with barrels of roses, and he knows it too, the poor stiff. He must be a pretty good scout after all, taking his medicine straight." Then Billy slid in and the quiet little ceremony began. The organ hushed into nothing. Marilyn arose, took Mark's arm, and together they stepped down and stood in front of the minister, who had come down the steps of the pulpit and was awaiting them, with Marilyn's mother sitting only a step away on the front seat. It was all so quiet and homey, without fuss or marching or any such thing, and when the ceremony was over, the bride and groom turned about in front of the bank of hemlock and roses, and their friends swarmed up to congratulate them. Then everybody went into the parsonage, where the ladies of the church had prepared a real country wedding breakfast, with Christmas turkey and fixings for a foundation, and going on from that. It wasn't every day in the year that Sabbath Valley got its minister's daughter married, and what if the parsonage was small, and only 50 could sit down at once? Everybody was patient, and it was all the more fun. The 3 guests from out of town, self-imposed, looked on with wonder and interest. It was a revelation. Marilyn looked up and found Big Ed Varens frankly staring at her, a puzzled, pleased expression on his large, coarse face. She was half annoyed and wondered why they had come to spoil this perfect day. Then suddenly the big man stepped across the little living room and spoke. "Mrs. Carter, we came over today because Opal said you had something that would help us begin over again and make life more of a success. I want to thank you for having this chance to see a little bit of heaven on earth before I die." Later, when the city guests were fed and comforted perhaps, and had climbed back into the big car, Billy stood on the front porch with a 3rd helping of ice cream and watched them back and turn and wallow away into the deep white world, and his heart was touched with pity. "Aw, gee, the poor fish. I suppose it is hard lines, and then it was sort of my fault, you know." And he turned with a joyful sigh that they were gone, and went in to look again at Mary Louise Little and see what it was about her in that new blue chalice that made her look so sort of nice today. End of chapter 30. End of The City of Fire by Grace Livingston Hill.